Mary and I had been park rangers for over a decade. My story is rather unusual, and you may believe it or not. It started with the missing hikers. At first, I thought they had simply gotten lost or wandered off the trail, but as more and more people went missing, I began to realize that something sinister was at play. Then there were the eerie noises at night, growls and snarls that sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to investigate. I spent countless hours going through the woods, searching for any signs of the missing hikers or the source of the noises. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find anything. And then one night, it happened. I was walking back to my cabin after a long day of searching when I heard a rustling in the bushes. I reached for my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise, but all I could see were two glowing eyes staring back at me. Before I had a chance to react, the creature lunged at me. It was massive, easily 3,000 pounds, and had 5 legs instead of the usual 4. Its fur was matted and its teeth were bared. I knew in that moment that I was in serious danger. I reached for my gun and fired a shot, hitting the creature in the shoulder. It let out a deafening roar and retreated back into the woods. I was shaken but relieved that I had survived the attack. Over the next few days, I searched the woods for any sign of the creature, but there was nothing. No tracks, no fur, nothing to indicate that it had ever been there. It was as if the creature had vanished into thin air. From that point on, I was on high alert. I never ventured into the woods alone and always carried my gun with me. But no matter how much I prepared, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, watching and waiting. Days passed without any sign of the creature, and I began to let my guard down. I thought that perhaps I had scared it off for good. But then, one day, I received a strange signal from deep in the woods. It was from a hiker who had gone missing. I knew what I had to do. I gathered a team of search and rescue experts, and we set out into the woods to find the missing hiker. As we searched, we had a feeling that this unknown predator was somewhere near. And then, just as we were about to give up hope, we found him. The missing hiker, alive and well. He told us that he had been wandering through the woods when he heard a rustling in the bushes, and then out of nowhere, the creature had appeared, staring at him with those glowing eyes. But this time, it just growled and went back into the woods. As we made our way back to civilization, I couldn't help but feel relieved that we had found the hiker alive. But I also knew that the creature was still out there. We'd been up on Hooper's Bald Trailhead with the intent of stargazing. However, it was unusually warm for the end of October 2019. Thick fog rolled in around 9 p.m., and we eventually gave up around 11 p.m. We sat and talked to an older couple who had pulled off to spend the night due to the fog, and we eventually left at maybe 1 a.m. from the Hooper Bald Overlook parking area. We made our way back down slowly until the scenic overlook at Chute Cove. By the time we got there, at maybe 1:30 a.m., the fog and most of the clouds had subsided. There is a small parking lot at this overlook that holds maybe 7 cars and a field the size of a soccer pitch separating you from the tree line, with some picnic tables dotted around. We pulled up, got out of the car, turned it off along with the lights, and set up our tripods, cameras, and lenses to take some photos of the stars and try and catch some of the Milky Way if possible on long exposure. We were about 15 to 20 photos in, each exposure being about 30 seconds or so. In this time, no cars passed, no owls hooted, no foxes screamed, only the faint sounds of some bugs and the occasional bat fluttering about. Later on, it was eventually deathly quiet. No sounds, not bugs chirping, nor bats fluttering around, not even leaves rustling in the wind. It was eerie, to say the least. I got the feeling a little uneasy. I can't pinpoint why, but I was getting that fluttery feeling in my chest. We kept taking pictures for a few minutes longer. But as time went on, we could hear some things going on in the woods, namely, what I could best describe as either stones being tossed or shuffling in the tree line. I ignored this for maybe 5 minutes or so. To me, it sounded like it was at our 10 and 2 o'clock positions, relative to where we were. There was also an occasional wood-on-wood sound, but not like a branch falling. It was repetitive and slow and only one hit, unlike a branch that would hit a lot on its way down. After what sounded like a branch snapping to our 9 or 10 o'clock, my fiance just said, "Did you hear that?" I said quietly, "Yes." "Was that the first one you heard?" And they responded back, "No, we need to leave." We had both been scanning the tree line, but were unable to see any direct movement. It spooked us both so badly, we packed up the cameras and walked backwards to the car, never turning our backs to the direction of the sounds. We opened the doors, tossed our gear into the back seat, got in, and locked the doors. Basically, as soon as we reached the car. We sat in it for about 2 or 3 minutes after cranking it up and turning on the lights, but never saw anything. I am a fairly avid hiker and primitive or semi-primitive camper, and have run across deer, bear, and even the occasional wild dog or coyote. But nothing has ever just given me the willies before. It was uncanny and unnerving. My fiancé said it was like they just had the primal urge to run, like we were being hunted or stalked. I had the same feeling, like something was there, or a small group of somethings, and they were closing in. By the time we got in the car, I felt like we were prey. We never saw anything. No animal, no creature, no glint of eyes in the tree line. I would like to think we didn't just get scared over nothing, but who knows? Late at night, where we can't see or hear well, our minds can play tricks on us. I've chatted with them before posting this to make sure I recalled it the same way. We had not spoken of it since that trip, but we both have the same impression of the encounter. We both feel like there were at least 2 things starting to flank us, and that we were prey, in my words, or hunted in theirs. I'm not really sure if there are any local lore or creatures of the woods in this area from native tales that would fit this. I am insanely skeptical on all matters of cryptids, but this was just bizarre. Bears don't really do much in groups. Wild canines like wolves and coyotes don't usually flank humans, and I doubt any normal group animal would cross an open field without any cover. I want to explain encounter with something logical, but I'm not quite sure what it was. I had gotten into an argument with my mom about the Hat Man that was leaning over me while I slept on the couch, something my sister informed me of the following day. A lot of weird stuff happened at that house, but that wasn't the encounter. No, it was after the argument. I was walking out of the house, down the road. We were surrounded by woods, and a small swamp was behind our place. I was walking down the road, which was wooded on both sides. Not many people came down where we were, so I was listening to music on my walk, and I felt like something was watching me. I lived in Alabama, so it was weird. Nobody came into our woods, not ever. I looked over, and there I saw it. He was hunched over and huge. He had pale features and was so skinny I could see his ribcage. The thing that threw me off was his mask-like face. He didn't wear a mask, but his face had mask-like features. The only reason I say his face wasn't wearing a mask was because I could see his mouth perfectly. He had dark eyes. I thought he had eye bags, but maybe I was just trying to reassure myself. I heard a branch crunch under his hand, or at least I like to assure myself it was his hand. He reminded me of a human, but all wrong. Please, someone tell me they've got some explanation, because I can't. Thank you. I was 4 years old. I have experienced paranormal events my entire life. Sightings, dreams, and premonitions. This is one of my first experiences that I have memory of. We lived in a cedar-sided split-floor home on top of a mountain. I had a younger brother, about 10 months old. We shared a bedroom across the hall from my parents' room. We would see this figure constantly. We saw it so much that we started to just ignore it. It stood about 3 or 4 feet tall, had an outline like a teddy bear, and wore a classic Viking helmet with horns. But we never could see its features, just the dark shadow. Our older cousin, 1 or 2 years older, spent the night one night. Everyone was in a circle with our sleeping bags on the floor of our room. The lights were still on. My cousin immediately whispered, "What is that?" and pointed at the creature who was standing in our doorway, watching us. I told him it was just our monster, and he watches us play. He can't do anything to us or hurt us. I stuck my tongue out at it to assure my cousin the thing was harmless. My mom had told us monsters couldn't get us, so I was extra brave around it. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night. I slept on the top bunk and my brother on the bottom. I saw the creature climbing up the bunk bed ladder to my bed. To this day, I have no idea why or how I was brave enough to do this. But I moved to the ladder and sat in front of it, blocking the creature from coming up. It stopped climbing, but we were inches from each other's faces. It seemed like we sat like that forever, because I remember thinking, what the heck is this? And why can't I see its actual face? I reached out and tapped its shoulder. All hell broke loose as soon as I touched it. I could see all of it. The entire body was covered in monster heads. Its main face had giant eyes and sharp, sharp teeth. It was terrified of me, confused, and seemed to be in intense pain from my touch. It grabbed me by the back and tore my back up, screamed in my face. Of course, I was screaming hysterically. I broke free and crawled to the far end of my bed, started praying, and stopped screaming. By this time, my mom ran in, and all I could say was, "Monster." The next morning, my mom casually made me come into the kitchen to show her best friend my back. As an adult, my mom told me she was so scared that my back was all scratched up. Scratches I didn't have that night at bedtime. I asked my cousin what he saw that night. He admitted to it 30+ years later and told me when I stuck my tongue out, he was terrified. As an adult, my brother described the exact same appearance of it after having a summer encounter shortly after mine. He passed it on our basement stairs, and it screamed at him. After my encounter, I never saw it again. My son, who is 3, is terrified of shadows, and he knows the difference between normal shadows. He tells me one walks around in his room. Is it the same thing? What the hell is it? While I was cutting cross-country along the Maxwell Book Trail to some reprieve above my camp, I found 2 impressions in a dung pile unlike any I've seen before. The prints were about a quarter-mile apart, but on the same ridge and identical in size, both having a prominent big toe impression. The dung pile was 12 to 14 inches in length and as big around as a 50-cent piece. I also had a visitor outside my tent at 4 a.m. I was awake and drinking coffee in my dimly lit tent. I keep the gas lantern down low to cut down noise and listen for bugling elk, so I should have heard any animal approach. But I heard nothing, until a sliding, scraping sound followed by a loud thud, like a person sliding at a log or a stump just a few feet outside the tent. I listened for the critter to leave, but I heard no sound. It concerned me that nothing ran away, so I grabbed an axe, went outside, and yelled, but still no movement. It was big. The thud it made was louder than I could make stomping on the ground. I forgot to mention that right before the sound, I heard a low growl that made me look down at my stomach and wonder why I didn't feel my stomach growling. It was low and long. I thought it was me at first. I bought a cottage on Mattagami Lake in June 2000. Mattagami Lake is located approximately 90 kilometers south of Timmins, Ontario, off Highway 144 towards Sudbury. It's a water access cottage, and all the lots in our area are in the 1.5-acre range. We've spent every summer there since. I also grew up spending all my summers at our family cottage since the age of 5, so I'm no stranger to being surrounded by forest. I'm very familiar with the sounds of nature and wildlife in the area. As kids, we used to wander off into the odd logging roads behind the cottage in the middle of the night. No flashlights, no care in the world. We never came across anything remotely scary, strange, or unexplained. Anyway, back to adulthood. One night about 10 years ago, my wife and I were at the cottage on an early spring weekend. I believe it was either late April or early May. The only other people around that weekend were our neighbors, 2 doors down on one side, and my wife's parents, 3 doors down on the other. I know our neighbors well. They're in their 70s and never wander outside after dark. Nor do my wife's parents. It was about 9:15 p.m. and getting dark fairly fast. My wife and I were sitting by the fire behind the cottage, facing the woods. The forest behind the cottage stretches for many miles. My wife decided to go to bed, and after she went inside, I sat quietly, staring at the fire, when I heard what sounded like 3 whacks in the distance behind the cottage. I couldn't gauge the distance, but I guessed it might have been between half a kilometer to a kilometer straight back, based on the trailing echo. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. Another 10 to 15 minutes went by, then I heard it again. Same 3 whacks, but closer, louder, with less echo. I thought maybe a moose was hitting its antlers against a tree, but that time of year, they don't have antlers. Besides, the 3 consistent whacks seemed too well timed and way too loud. I sat there trying to figure it out. Another 15 minutes later, I heard the same 3 whacks, this time really close, maybe within a few hundred feet. I immediately stood up. It made no sense. The bush is thick back there, and by now it was pitch black. No lights. I stood there with only a pen-sized LED flashlight. I considered getting the axe from the garage, but I didn't want to leave the cottage. I quietly walked along the deck to the front of the cottage, stopped to listen, then went back toward the back. As I stood there listening, the 3 whacks came again, this time probably less than 100 feet away, right at the tree line behind the fire pit. I immediately ran to the front of the cottage, went in, and locked the door. I went to the back bedroom and peeked out at the fire pit. I expected to see someone, or something, but there was nothing. I didn't hear anything else. It took me hours to fall asleep. My heart was racing. A few years later, something else happened, but I wasn't alone this time. At least 10 of us were out there when we heard a blood-curdling scream from a few hundred yards away. Everyone stopped talking and looked at each other. Soon after, the same type of scream came from deep in the forest, as if answering the first one. I scoured the internet and listened to all kinds of animal sounds and screams. Nothing comes close. Was it Bigfoot? We've never seen anything resembling one, but I believe that's what we have around us. I was driving home on an isolated road through a mountainous area in Tilda County, Pennsylvania. It was late, and I was exhausted. I was in and out of a daydream state. You know how it is when you're tired and pushing on. The caffeine wasn't helping, and I was too cheap to get a hotel. Then, as I approached a curve, my headlights lit up something that looked like a person, but almost double or triple in size. I swerved to avoid it and woke up immediately. I wasn't sure if I clipped it, but my car slid into a ditch. I got out to check if I'd hit someone, but there was no one. I was certain I saw something. The car was stuck. I sat in it, thinking I saw movement. Then the driver's side window was suddenly blocked by the drenched, furry body of something large, on 2 legs, but definitely not human. It peered in the window, ugly, evil-looking, long wolf-like snout, yellow fangs, and eyes that glowed unnaturally. It scratched the window with a long claw, grinning, as if it knew I couldn't run. Then another one appeared, and another. I don't know how many. I was frozen in fear. Then, in an instant, they were gone. I didn't understand why, until a pickup truck pulled up behind me. An old man stepped out, asked if I was okay, and pulled me out of the ditch. I told him what I saw. He got a strange look like he'd heard it before, but wouldn't say more. That was in November 2020. I'll never forget it. I can only imagine what may have happened to me if that old man had not come to my rescue. This was back in '66 or '67, not sure. I was between 17 and 18 years old. Me and 3 friends stayed the night out in the desert of Adelanto, California. One of them lived in a trailer in the middle of nowhere, which was fine because we were partying. Something happened during the kickback, and I got mad, stormed off outside, and walked for a good 5 minutes. All of a sudden, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I was confused by this unintentional reaction to God only knows what. I stopped walking. All wildlife stopped with me. No more crickets, no owls, dead silence. I looked straight ahead to my left and saw a figure about 6 feet or more moving between 2 large cacti. I immediately booked it. I ran as fast as I could, knowing something was chasing me. I ran inside the trailer and slammed the door, screaming bloody murder, frantically trying to tell my friends what had just happened. They all started laughing, thinking I was nuts. But then, out of nowhere, you could hear a scrape running alongside the trailer, like claws on metal. Everyone froze, and we spent the rest of the night guarding all doors and windows. After that night, it was never spoken of again. Has anyone experienced anything like this? My father worked at NASA's Johnson Space Center. As a teenager growing up in the suburbs of Houston, Texas, I was also able to make my way into the great outdoors. I was a Boy Scout, and we would take numerous camping trips throughout Texas, the hill country, and the piney woods. My mother's parents owned a ranch in northeast Texas, and it was a frequent family destination for holidays and sometimes just for a vacation. I learned how to fish, hunt, pitch a tent, and basic survival skills at an early age. I would often take treks into the woods by myself without a care in the world. Thinking back on certain events that happened back then, I now view them differently, mostly because of what I'm about to tell you. It was a later experience in the Ozark National Forest at night, and it has profoundly changed the way I look at life. I moved to Northwest Arkansas in 2005. My brother and mother had already moved to Rias Mill, Arkansas. I would frequently fish at Lake Lincoln. I would often park my truck a short walking distance from the dam and then walk up and fish from the dam bank. During one visit, I began to work my way off the dam and into some thick brush and trees to get to a large boulder protruding over the lake's bank. As I approached the tree line, I began to have an eerie feeling. It came over me out of nowhere. Now, I've been in the woods alone many times before and never felt this sensation. I quickly grabbed my rod and reel, along with my tackle box, and made it back to my truck. I have not been back to Lake Lincoln since. A year later, around 2007, I had moved about 40 minutes from my mother's place. I had just gone into business for myself. I was single and lived alone. I would often get bored and take drives through the mountains, sometimes even at night. One late night, I decided I needed to get out for a long ride. I was going to head to my mother's place. I started down the freeway and then exited onto Highway 16. I continued down Highway 16 for about 20 miles, then turned left onto County Road 33. It was another 10 miles or so before turning off to get to my mother's home. I crossed the Illinois River Bridge and made a sharp curve to the left. It went up a steep hill and then entered the Ozark National Forest. It was dark, only my headlights lighting the way. At the time, there was no cell service. I was smack dab in the middle of nowhere. I reached Wellington late. As I began to climb the next hill, I remembered a small pull-off lookout to my left. I needed to relieve myself. I pulled my truck over, crossed the oncoming lane, and parked on the lookout shoulder. I left the motor running with the headlights on. I stepped out, leaving the truck door open, and began to relieve myself. To the right of me was somewhat of a cliff. I could see a small pond on the opposite side of the lake, which was to my left. I found myself fixated on that ridgetop. Then I had this overwhelming feeling come over me. The hairs on the back of my neck began to stand up, and goosebumps ran down my arms. There was a strong sense that someone or something was watching me. I was standing outside a lit-up truck in the middle of nowhere. I was a sitting duck. I quickly finished, jumped into my truck, threw it into drive, and squealed my wheels up the hill. Some years later, I married and became a father. My family and I went hiking through the same lake area, but on the other side. There was a rock-covered enclosure that Parks and Recreation had built some years back. While there, those same eerie feelings came back. Something wasn't right. I kept it to myself, and we finished our day of fun. A short time later, I found myself researching Bigfoot sightings in Arkansas. A significant sighting had been documented in that same area just prior to my roadside event. I also read of a sighting of a red-headed Bigfoot digging in the sand underneath a bridge along the Illinois River. I found out the sightings had been documented all over this area, dating back many years. Then I began to think of my childhood, and things began to add up. Like the time my grandmother told my brother and me not to venture back into certain parts of the wooded area. Or the times Grandpa's bird dogs would go into a barking frenzy in the middle of the night, and he would step outside, shooting a shotgun into the air. I can't venture into the woods much anymore, certainly not alone, and certainly not at night. I'm a Bigfoot believer. I truly feel that my overwhelming strange feelings were the result of a Bigfoot either watching me or being in the area. As a park ranger, I've always loved exploring the wilderness, and I've seen some strange things over the years. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found deep in the heart of the park. It was a hot summer day, and I was on patrol, making my way through a dense thicket of trees when I stumbled upon a small town. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. At first, I thought I had stumbled upon some sort of movie set. The buildings were small and rustic, made of weathered wood, and surrounded by gardens filled with herbs and vegetables. The people who lived there were Native Americans, and they all seemed busy with their daily tasks. They stopped and looked at me as if they were surprised to see me. As I approached, I was greeted by a man who introduced himself as the leader of the community. He explained that they had been living there for generations, in harmony with nature and each other. They had no interest in the outside world and preferred to keep to themselves. I was fascinated by their way of life and spent the next few hours talking to the locals and learning about their customs and traditions. But as the sun began to set, they started to warn me about something I had never heard of before: the Wendigo. They told me the Wendigo was a dangerous creature that roamed the deep woods, preying on anyone foolish enough to venture into its territory. They warned me to stay away from the woods at night and always be on the lookout for any signs of the creature. I didn't believe them, of course. I'd seen my fair share of dangerous animals in the park, but I had never heard of anything like the Wendigo. I thanked them for their hospitality and went on my way, convinced they were just trying to scare me. As I made my way back to the ranger station, the sun had already set, and the woods were shrouded in darkness. I heard strange noises coming from the trees, and I could feel a sense of unease creeping up on me. It was as if the forest itself was alive and watching me. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall and emaciated, with long, bony limbs and piercing red eyes. It stood there watching me before disappearing into the woods. I was terrified. I had never felt so alone and vulnerable in my life. I tried to run, but I quickly realized I was hopelessly lost. The woods seemed to stretch in all directions, and I had no idea which way to go. As the night wore on, the creature continued to haunt me, appearing and disappearing, as if toying with me. I was cold, hungry, and scared out of my mind. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The sun began to rise, and the creature was gone. When I finally made it back to the ranger station, I was a mess. I had never been so scared in my life, and I knew I had come dangerously close to becoming the Wendigo's next victim. I tried to tell my colleagues what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I was just tired and imagining things. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I would never forget the terror I experienced in those woods. From that day on, I made sure to listen to the warnings of the locals and always be on the lookout for any signs of danger, because in the deep woods of the park, you never know what might be lurking just beyond the trees. This was my boyfriend's experience, not my own. He grew up in Mesa, Arizona. Really early in the morning, when he was pretty young, he woke up and couldn't fall back asleep. He looked out the window of his bedroom, and there was a man-wolf crouched down on the driveway, facing the window. He described it like a man with a wolf skin or head on top of him. He went back to bed, still couldn't sleep, so he looked again, and the creature was standing right there, with glowing eyes peering into the window. He freaked out, crawled back into bed, and just tried to fall asleep. Could have been a dream. Thanks for listening, cowboys and cowgirls. Hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we dive deep into the horror of the American countryside. See you then.
Can you tell me what time you are listening to this video? How do you feel about my video? If you like, please like and subscribe, and comment to let me know. That is a great motivation for me. Thank you guys.
I'm a seasonal caretaker at a national park in Alaska. I won't say which one because I still value my job, And I've been warned by my employers to keep my mouth shut about anything unusual I've seen during my time here. That being said, there are some very strange things that I've seen over the last 4 years, and I figured I'd share some with you. You may not even be aware of what a seasonal caretaker is, and that's completely understandable. Generally, it's not that exciting, if I'm being honest. I start my season when the park is closed for the winter, and it's my responsibility to make sure that the various cabins and public buildings are maintained and that the snow is kept cleared from the roofs to prevent any damage, that sort of thing. It's a lonely job, and if you're a people person, it's probably not for you. It takes a bit of an odd duck to willingly put themselves into exile for 3 months at a time, knowing that there's no way out until the snow begins to melt and the plows can start clearing some of the access roads that lead out to my cabin. I do have a snowmobile that I can use to take the 3-hour trip to the nearest ranger station if I need to, but it's not like a quick trip to the corner store. It's just fine for me, though. I've always been a bit of a loner, and I have Max, my Jack Russell Terrier, to keep me company. The job isn't very demanding. I typically only spend a few days each week tending to my responsibilities, and the rest of the time is mine to do with as I please. A few years ago, I took up nature photography as a hobby to pass the time, and I've even had a few of my pictures published by an organization you'd recognize by name. I have framed copies of those magazines hanging on the wall behind me right now. As a matter of fact, a lot of people come through this park during the more temperate months. It's probably one of the most popular places for outdoorsy folks to explore in this region of Alaska. In the winter months, however, it's completely deserted, except for a few lonely ranger stations and the like. I'll go for weeks at a time without seeing a soul, and the only person I speak with any regularity is my ranger buddy. We'll call him Rick, who I check in with a few times a week on the radio. Aside from that, it's just me and Max. I'm not sure how best to go about telling you about some of the things I've seen up here in the dark, frozen days of winter, so I'll just dive right in and tell you about the shades. At least, that's what I call them when I'm talking to myself. I have no idea what they really are, but when the winter storms are blowing strong against my shuttered cabin windows and the visibility in the snow and dim light is next to nothing, you'll see them. It's almost like looking at someone moving behind a pane of frosted glass, all indistinct and shadowy. At first, I just thought my mind was playing tricks on me, finding patterns in the chaotic static of all that falling snow. But then I started hearing them as well, like murmurings, just loud enough to hear over the howl of the wind, but too quiet to recognize as any sort of intelligent speech. It's enough to set you on edge. I can tell you that much. They tend to only show up during a heavy snowstorm, and the fiercer the storm, the closer they'll come to the cabin. It's gotten to the point where I'll make sure I've locked all my doors and windows long before nightfall if I know there's a storm coming. One time, during an especially nasty blizzard, I could actually hear them moving around my cabin, like some sort of nightmare parade. That night was bad. At one point, I actually saw and heard the doorknob on my front door turning, all slow and deliberate, accompanied by what sounded like soft scratching on the wooden surface. The worst of it, and I'll swear on a stack of Bibles that it's the truth, was the faint whispering that kept calling my name just on the other side of the door. That went on for an hour or more. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can still hear that cold, hollow voice. It's what I imagine a person would sound like if their soul were ripped from their body. I suppose I'm being a little overly dramatic, but it's the only way I can describe it. Alive, but also lifeless. I don't know a better way to explain it. No reason to dwell on it, I guess. I will say that I'm not sure what would have happened if I hadn't remembered to throw the deadbolt that night. I'm not interested in finding out. But thinking about it makes me anxious. I mentioned it to Rick the next day, after the storm had quieted and I could get a radio signal out. I expected him to laugh at me for letting myself get all spooked by the dark, but he didn't. He very calmly and firmly told me that it was better not to talk about them at all, and to just make sure I kept myself locked up nice and tight when the heavy snowstorms came. I tried to prod him for more information, but he just refused to elaborate any further. The only thing he would add was that not everything sleeps when winter comes on up here. I have to admit, he creeped me out even more with that little zinger. He definitely knows something about them, and I'm going to try to pin him down one day and get more information. The next thing on the list is the car graveyard. I kid you not, if you explore far enough off the beaten trail out here, chances are pretty good you'll find one. A car or truck just inexplicably deposited in the middle of backwater Alaska. Like that makes any sense at all. The first one I ever saw was an early 2000s BMW coupe, looking like it was just off the showroom floor. Except for the fact that half of it was embedded in an old spruce that had probably stood there since before cars even existed. It almost looked like the tree had grown around the car, or maybe the car had been interposed into the tree. I don't know how it's possible. I just know that it was there. I've seen a few of them during my time here, sometimes trapped in the trees like that BMW, and sometimes just sitting in the middle of an open space of ground. Every one of them looked like they were fresh off the road, and none of them had any logical way they could have gotten out there, even without the whole stuck in the trees part. The most unnerving thing about the cars, though, is the clothing. I've stopped looking and just tend to avoid going anywhere near one if I see it. But the first time I saw one, my curiosity led me to check it out. I tried the doors, but they were all locked. When I looked in through the windows, though, I saw the damnedest thing. In the front seats, it looked like someone had laid out clothes, pants, shirts, socks, shoes, the whole deal, and strapped the seatbelts around them. It was like the people in the car had just vanished mid-drive, leaving their clothes behind just the way they'd been wearing them. Eerie is one word for it. But if I'm being honest, it scared the hell out of me. The other thing about the cars is that you won't find the same one twice. When I saw that first BMW, I came back out the next day with my camera to take a picture of it. But it wasn't there anymore. I thought I'd simply forgotten where it was, or I'd gotten turned around. But then I saw my boot prints in the snow from the day prior, and I knew I was in the right spot. I tried to report this to the Rangers as well, but Rick told me they wouldn't even send someone out to investigate them anymore. By the time anyone got there, they'd be gone. Apparently, reports of this sort of thing have been coming in periodically over the last 20 or 30 years, and nobody knows anything about them. He did tell me that one of the Rangers had found one once, a school bus from Texas, if you can believe that. In each of the rows of seats were piles of empty clothes, with the exception of the driver. The ranger that found it said the driver was sort of there, but not really, almost like a blurry hologram frozen in time. He said the driver, an elderly man, looked like he was frozen in some terrified scream, all wide-eyed and gaping-mouthed. The ranger tried to get into the bus using the rear emergency door, but when he got the door open, a loud buzzing sound filled his ears, and a high-frequency vibration ran through his body like an electric shock. He said the closer he got, the more intense the sound and sensation became. Before he could take even a step inside the bus, it grew so strong that he thought he was going to pass out. The best he could describe it was like when you have two strong opposing magnets that you're trying to push together. The more you push, the stronger the resistance becomes. He said it was almost like the universe was somehow keeping him out of that bus, like he didn't belong in it. He stumbled away from it and spent the next day in bed, sicker than a dog. When he came back out a few days later with some other Rangers, the bus was gone. I can't really speak for the buzzing and vibrating personally. I just know that I avoid them whenever I see them. They're just not right. The last thing I'll tell you about is the bridge. About a mile or so away from my cabin, along a maintained footpath, there's a rope bridge that crosses a deep ravine. To the side of it, there's a bit of rock jutting out that's used as a kind of observation point. You know what I mean? Where hikers will stop and take selfies along their trek to post to Facebook or Twitter or whatever. The Parks Department even went through the trouble of installing handrails along the edge of it to prevent anyone from falling to their death. Of course, there aren't any hikers here during the winter season. The park is technically closed, and all roads leading into the area are blocked by chains to prevent anyone from driving in and getting into trouble with no possibility of rescue. I hike down that path probably once a week, looking for new photo opportunities to occupy my time. It's a beautiful walk, and the whole landscape seems so crisp and fresh without people tromping all over it. I've gotten some incredible shots of the bridge, but I don't dare step onto it when it's this cold. The boards are constantly frozen and slick with ice. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't take much of a misstep to fall on my ass and slide out from under the waist-high rope handholds. I'd be falling 200 feet to the rocks below before I even realized what was happening. Here's the weird part, though. Invariably, when I reach that bridge, I'll find multiple sets of footprints leading up the rocky outcropping, but none of them leading away from it. They come from all different directions, some from the path and others straight out from the trees, but they all seem to stop at the edge of the ravine. They're various sizes and stride lengths, some of them very small and others so large they have to have been made by some massive hulk of a person. The first time I saw them, I was afraid that some trespassers had gotten too close to the edge and fallen over. But when I spent the better part of a day making my way carefully to the floor of the ravine, I couldn't find any sign that anyone had been there besides me. I'll be the first to admit that I'm no tracker, but even I can tell when footprints in fresh snow lead to a place and don't return. I've walked out onto that outcropping myself once to see if I could figure out where all these people had gone. Maybe there was a hidden path that I wasn't seeing. But the moment my foot touched that stone, my head began to throb like I was suffering from the worst hangover I'd ever had. When I staggered back from it, the pain disappeared like it had never been there. And I was left with a pretty insistent nosebleed for the rest of the afternoon as my only souvenir. I didn't try again. Max won't even go anywhere near it. He'll start whining as we start approaching that part of the trail. Mind you, this is a dog that I've had to wrestle inside the cabin on multiple occasions because he's so incensed that a pack of wolves dared wander too close to his territory. For all of his small stature, he doesn't seem to have the self-preservation gene that tells him when he should be afraid of something. But not the Overlook, though. That's a different story altogether. Even Max has his limits, I guess. I have more stories, but I'm getting a little tired, and it's about time for me to get some sleep. Tomorrow, I need to head out to the cabins by the frozen lake and make sure the roofs are clear. I'll write a bit more later. Next time, I'll tell you about the dead bears. That's a strange one. Hey all, it's me again. First of all, wow. I didn't expect this sort of response. Thanks for all the great feedback on my previous post. Honestly, I wasn't sure how interested anyone would be in some of the things going on out here, and I was more than a little surprised when I got back to my cabin yesterday and saw the responses. Before I get rolling with some more experiences I've had out here, I just wanted to address a few questions or comments that folks made on my last update. Someone suggested that I should try to capture the shades with my camera. That's a good suggestion, and I've already tried that on a couple of occasions. The issue I've run into is that because of the darkness and the snow, I really only have two options. Either use a flash or some other light source, or else use a long shutter speed on my camera. Even though I was pretty sure neither one would work, I've actually tried both methods. Unfortunately, as anyone who has driven in a snowstorm can attest, snow is great at reflecting light, which is why you can't use your high beams when driving in it. The light just reflects off the snow and back into your eyes, effectively blinding you. My results using this method were about what you'd expect. Nothing but a complete whiteout in the captured images. Using a slow shutter speed didn't yield any better result at all. All I got were images of completely incomprehensible motion blurs. I suppose there are probably better camera rigs out there that may be able to overcome some of these challenges, but I don't know of them. Even if they do exist, they're probably well outside my budget. The National Park Service doesn't exactly pay seasonal caretakers in gold bullion. There was also a concern that even though I'm trying to remain anonymous, I've given away enough details about myself that my employers could easily identify me. Don't worry about that. Firstly, there are more than 20 national parks in Alaska, covering over 50 million acres of land. Believe it or not, it actually contains the majority of the national park land in the entire United States, something like 65% of it. As you can imagine, there are a lot of folks spread out across the state doing similar jobs to mine. It's hard to envision exactly how expansive Alaska is and how much of it is covered with stark wilderness until you've been here and seen it for yourself. I guess I didn't have the faintest clue before I got here from the lower 48. The bottom line is that it's pretty unlikely anyone from the NPS will be able to identify me from what I've told you about myself. If they do, I guess we'll cross that bridge then. Finally, someone asked me about the license plates I've seen on some of the vehicles that mysteriously appear out here in the wilderness, and whether they were all from one area or from all over. I've previously mentioned that I tend to avoid them if I come across them anymore. But I can tell you that the first car I ran across, the BMW, had a European-style license plate on the front. I assumed at the time it was just one of those trendy plates that folks in the US sometimes put on the front of their European cars for decoration. But it's possible that it was legitimately from somewhere in Europe. I'm not sure. I recall that it was white and blue, but beyond that, I don't remember much about it. Of course, the bus that the ranger found had Texas plates on it, but I don't know about any others. Sorry. Okay. So now that I've cleared those points up, let's dive into some of the other things going on out here. Since I mentioned it in the previous post, I'll start off with the bears. So you probably know this, but Alaska has some of the largest and most dangerous bears in the entire world. Fortunately, the Kodiak and the polar bear aren't generally found inland up here, but we still have more than our fair share of grizzlies and large black bears, both of which are apex predators and will make quick work of the unwary or unprepared. Now, since my contract covers the colder winter months, most of these bears are hibernating during my time here. That being said, not all bears hibernate, especially if they're in an area of plentiful food supply. Also, even when they are hibernating, they'll still become pretty active from time to time. So you definitely can't let your guard down if you want to stay on the side of the grave. It's a pretty safe bet that anyone who works up here, especially alone, tends to carry a rifle as well as a large caliber handgun whenever they're outside of their cabin. I'm no exception to that. I carry a 45-70 lever action over my shoulder and a 500 Magnum revolver in a chest holster. At first glance, it may seem like overkill. That is a tremendous amount of firepower, after all. However, the first time you catch a glimpse of a mama grizzly with her cubs and realize that you're looking at an 800-pound predator that can run you down in a heartbeat, you'll start wondering why I don't carry even more. The reason I mention all this isn't to give you the impression that there's some sort of mythical monster hiding behind every tree, just waiting to pounce, only that they represent the top of the food chain up here. Period. Nothing, and I mean nothing, short of a pack of starving wolves, will even threaten one. And even that's only been documented on a handful of occasions. They're massive, powerful, and aggressive. And if you live out in their territory and don't keep your head on a swivel, you're an idiot, and probably soon to be converted into bear scat. So all that being the case, I'm sure you'll understand what it means when I tell you something is killing big grizzlies out here. I'm not talking about poachers or indigenous hunters or anything like that. I'm talking about something, as in not humans, and definitely not hungry wolves. But let me back up a step. My first season up here as a winter caretaker was a hell of a learning experience. just trying to figure out the necessary maintenance routines and learning how to navigate around my area of responsibility was a little overwhelming. One day, I was returning from making my rounds out to one of the ranger stations that was shut down for the winter and ended up taking a wrong turn on the trail. By the time I realized my mistake, I was already a fair distance along the new path and wandering into unfamiliar territory. Just as I was getting ready to turn around and retrace my steps, I topped a rise and was suddenly faced with the unmistakable form of a grizzly, not 30 feet along the path ahead and facing away from me. I've got to tell you, I almost pissed myself as I fumbled to unsling my rifle from my shoulder. It's a damn good thing I didn't actually need it at that moment, because I discovered to my dismay that I had stupidly slung my shoulder pack over top of the rifle sling, effectively trapping it against my body. Stupidity and complacency are what get you killed out here, folks. And I could have been a perfect example of both at that moment. As it turns out, the bear wasn't moving. It was just standing there, perfectly still, its hindquarters facing me. And I knew instinctively that something was wrong with it. Giving up on my rifle, I grabbed my handgun from its holster and cautiously approached the grizzly, my eyes intent on the bear and prepared for the slightest hint of movement. The closer I got to it, though, the more certain I became that it wasn't going to suddenly lunge at me and give me a lesson on exactly where in the food chain I was placed. Here's where it gets surreal. Before I got close to it, I had already recognized that it was dead. What I couldn't explain was why it was still standing. It had clearly been there for a while, as there were no paw prints leading up to it in the snow. And as I rounded to the front of it, I could see the flesh around its muzzle was already starting to decompose and pull back from its skull. When I got a good look at it, I could see that it was missing tufts of fur here and there. Despite all that, it was still standing, like it had died and just forgotten to fall down. I looked it over pretty closely, which was still an unnerving exercise, dead or not, but I couldn't find any sort of wounds or blood that might indicate why it had died. It was then that I realized a couple of things. Firstly, that there were grizzlies in the area that were active. And secondly, nothing had scavenged the carcass. To say this is unusual is an understatement. Most of the top carnivores in this area, including wolves, wolverines, and foxes, supplement their diets by scavenging on carrion. The fact that this bear had died and remained completely intact wasn't just perplexing, it was unnatural. I reported the find to the ranger station and heard back later from Rick that there had been nearly a dozen other similar discoveries within that general area in the last 2 months. The NPS had even brought in some fancy zoological pathologists from Anchorage to figure out what had killed the bears. They spent 2 weeks in the field with the rangers examining the carcasses, and then one morning they were just gone. They had apparently been abruptly recalled without so much as a "by your leave." Immediately after that, the carcasses were destroyed and the investigation shut down. A week later, a rushed and astonishingly brief report came back indicating death by natural predation. No further investigation. Indicated natural predation? I'm not sure how a predator could have killed the bear I found without leaving a single mark on it or a trace of blood, let alone somehow keep it standing upright after death, and then deciding it wasn't even going to feed on the kill. I called bullshit, and so did the rangers. Rick told me his boss had tried to contact the pathologists for more information, but was told that they had all been reassigned and were no longer working with the Park Service. Not one to easily give up, Rick's boss tried calling a private cell number he had gotten from one of the pathologists during their visit. It went to a disconnected message indicating the phone was no longer in service. This was strange, because he had just spoken to the investigator using that very number only a couple of weeks prior, so he knew it was a good number. But late that night, he received a call from an unknown caller. When he answered it, he recognized the hushed voice of the pathologist he had befriended, sounding like they were whispering into their phone. "Leave it alone. Forget about it. was all they said before the line went dead. He tried calling the number back several times, but it just went to dead air each time. That was the last time he heard anything about it. He tried following up within NPS, but somehow nobody was able to find the records that such an investigation had ever existed, or even that any reports of the dead bears had been filed in the first place. Rick told me that for a while it was all his boss wanted to talk about. It had become like a splinter in his hand that he couldn't ignore. He called anyone he could think of in the chain of command at the NPS and any other agencies he thought might be able to provide some clue about what was going on. But he couldn't make an inch of headway. Then one day, he just stopped talking about it, like a switch had been thrown. One evening, Rick and his boss were having beers at the local bar after their shift and talking about how strange the whole thing was. Then, the next morning, his boss walked in looking a little shaky and out of sorts, went into his office, and closed the door. He didn't say 2 words to Rick that day. He never mentioned the incident again. A few times Rick had brought it up in conversation later on, and his boss just brushed the whole thing off and changed subjects, looking very uncomfortable about it. I don't know what happened, but if I had to guess, I'd say his boss was probably digging into something that wasn't meant to be dug into, and someone convinced him it was better if he just forgot about it. Look, I'm not some conspiracy theorist nutjob, okay? I just know the whole thing stinks to high heaven, and I'll just leave it at that. The other thing I'll tell you about today is what we call the Witch's Lodge. I'm not sure what it was originally. It's really not much more than a single-room log cabin built out in the deep bush. I've seen it a couple of times and been inside once. It's a bit of a hike from my post and not easily reached even by snowmobile, so I don't get out that way very often. Old abandoned cabins aren't really that unusual up here. You'll trip across them from time to time, although most aren't much more than a few walls and a collapsed roof after years of harsh Alaskan winters. The Witch's Lodge is a little different, though. As far as I'm aware, nobody's lived there in a long time, but whoever built it must have known what they were doing, because it looks every bit as solid and maintained as my own cabin. I'm not even sure how it got its name, honestly. I just know that's how it was introduced to me the first time, so that's how I'm introducing it to you. A couple of years ago, my ranger buddy Rick radioed me, asking if I wouldn't mind joining him in a search for a couple of missing hikers. A father and his 12-year-old son. I'm just a caretaker. I don't normally participate in ranger or search and rescue related activities, but apparently there wasn't anyone else available to accompany him that day. He had gotten a lead that the hikers may have been heading into my section of the park. In search and rescue efforts, especially during the dark Alaskan winters, finding someone quickly is critical if you want to find them alive. So he wanted to follow up on it sooner rather than later. Of course, I couldn't exactly refuse to help him, especially not when one of them was just a kid. A couple of hours later, I found myself trailing behind him through the knee-deep snow. We moved along a semi-familiar path for a while before turning left at a fork and starting along another trail I wasn't familiar with. He seemed like he knew where he was headed, like he had a particular destination in mind. And we didn't really talk much during the hike. We stopped a couple of times to rest and sip some hot coffee from our thermoses, but even then, we were both quiet. I think there was some sort of dark cloud hanging over his mood. I could see it in his narrowed eyes and drawn brow. It was infectious, and soon started manifesting itself in the back of my own mind. An hour later, we came across the place. I was surprised to see this perfectly preserved little cedar log cabin just sitting out there among the trees, looking for all the world like someone would come walking out the front door at any moment. Something about the place seemed off, though. Somehow, I knew that nobody lived there, that nobody had lived there in a long time. I can't explain it, but in that moment, I had this strange feeling that we weren't welcome there. Like something was telling me to turn around and head back while I still could. Before I had a chance to open my mouth about it, Rick turned to me and pointed toward the closed front door, where I could clearly see boot prints at its threshold. "Come on," he said over the wind that had just blown up, and I could see the grim set to his expression before he turned away and started toward the door. I noticed that he had drawn his handgun, so I did the same, though I had no idea why. We reached the entryway to the cabin. He put his hand on the latch. Before he lifted it, he paused and looked back at me with that same dark expression. "We're going to have to look inside," he said. "There's nothing to be found in there? Fine, just turn around and head back to your cabin for a couple glasses of whiskey by the fire. Maybe the other groups will find them." "But—" His eyes fixed hard on mine. "If we find anyone other than that idiot hiker and his kid inside, we're not going to look at them, and we're not going to say a single word to them. Understand? Even if they talk to us first." I nodded at him, more confused than anything else, but that wasn't good enough. "I need you to say it, John, to make sure you understand what I'm telling you," he said, and the set of his eyes was so serious and determined that I repeated his instructions back to him without a second thought. When I did, he gave a brief nod and lifted the latch, pushing the door inward. We stepped through the doorway and into the darkened room beyond. As soon as we did, I was overwhelmed by the stench of decay, mixed with the strong scent of herbs and something else, something sickly riding just under the surface of it. My eyes had just started to adjust to the dim light of the interior, and I was able to make out the sparse furnishings of the room. An old rickety table with a solitary low-back chair in front of a cold stone fireplace along the far wall. I thought I could just make out a cot, but I couldn't be sure. "Damn it, it's happened again," Rick said, almost under his breath, and the tone of warning in his voice drew my attention immediately. I turned to find him kneeling next to the desiccated husk of a man's body, dressed in gray snow pants and a red down jacket, slumped back against the wall. It looked like it had been there for years, and I stumbled backwards in shock without realizing it. "What the hell?" I exclaimed, not really knowing what else to say. Rick picked up something that was resting on the floor near the man's skeletal hand, looked briefly around the room, and then nodded to the door. "Time to go. I'll let the search and rescue team know we found the hikers," he said. I was more than a little confused. The body we were looking at was almost mummified. It had clearly been there a long time, and I told him as much, not to mention the fact that there was only one of them. If it was possible that this was the father, that still meant the son was somewhere out there. "It's too late, John," was all he said, pressing something into my hands as he passed me and stepped out the door. I looked down and realized I was holding a small notebook, the kind a person might keep in their pocket, just in case they needed to write something down. Numbly, I flipped it open. It was mostly empty, except for the first 2 pages, which were scrawled in sloppy cursive and pencil. I don't have it anymore, so this is as well as I remember it, but it should be close enough that you get the gist of it. "We found her cabin. God, I wish we hadn't. Nathan's gone. She took him. I've been wandering around in here for days, but I can't find my way out. I haven't seen Nathan or her since that first day. My boy is gone. How can I not find my way out? What's happening? I can hear her whispers taunting me, but it's always just a little further forward, around the next corner. I don't understand any of this. I'm so sorry." As it turns out, we did end up heading back to my cabin. Rick radioed the search and rescue team that he found the hikers in the log, and the person on the other end paused a long moment before replying with a simple acknowledgement. No questions. Nothing else. Just acknowledged Rick. We didn't say much to each other that night. We just sat in front of my fire and drank the rest of my Jameson until we both passed out. When I returned to consciousness the next morning, Rick had already gotten up and left. We haven't spoken about it since that day. The notebook was gone when I awoke, so I assume he took it with him. Clearly, he knows something about what happened, about that cabin. But I've never asked him. I'm not too sure I really want to know. It's hard enough to sleep at night out here sometimes. Speaking of which, I suppose it's time for me to sign off and get some shut-eye. It's already almost 2 a.m., and I've got a long day's work ahead of me tomorrow. It snowed pretty good today, and I was already behind in clearing the roof of the storage sheds near the old Firewatch tower. I'd rather not have to deal with the damage if the roof collapses, so I better get over there as soon as it lets up outside. I'll write more soon. Good night, all. I'm back again, but I think this may be my last post. It sounds like I may have attracted the attention of someone I didn't intend to, and after this update, I'm going to lay low and try to disappear. Let me bring you up to speed. First thing this morning, as I was getting suited up and ready to head out to the storage sheds near the old Firewatch tower, I heard a knocking on the door of my cabin. Being in the middle of a closed national park in the heart of an Alaskan winter, you can imagine I don't get many visitors. About the only people I ever see out here are my ranger buddy Rick and the guy who brings me fresh supplies every few weeks. Rick has never just shown up at my door without calling on the radio first. And I know he's had his hands full recently with a few separate incidents of missing hikers and one self-professed cryptozoologist. So I was surprised to hear his muffled voice calling my name through the locked door. When I opened it and ushered him inside, I saw immediately the concern set into his expression. Without a word, he stepped over to the fireplace and warmed his hands in front of the freshly smoldering log I had just added. "Hell, Rick, you gave me a bit of a start," I told him with a small chuckle, trying to lighten the air a little. Something was up, and I had a sinking feeling that it might have something to do with me. He turned away from the fire and looked at me a long moment in silence before speaking. "I got a call last night, John," he said. His face was creased with a frown. I couldn't tell whether it was one of worry, muted anger, or maybe a combination of both. "Oh, yeah?" I replied, trying to keep the tone as casual as I could. He pulled the wool cap off his head and ran a hand over it, smoothing out his short, neatly trimmed hair. "Yeah, so did a few other rangers, apparently." I nodded and took a sip from my coffee, feeling more uncomfortable by the moment. "What about? What do you think was about me?" He pointed at me with his cap. "You've attracted someone's attention with your little stories you've been posting online." "My stories? What stories?" I said evenly, feigning innocence. I hadn't discussed these posts with Rick since I started updating them. Sure, we chatted about the possibility of me doing some in the past, but I hadn't told him that I'd actually written them. As far as he knew, I was just blowing smoke. My palms began to sweat, despite the fact that my cabin's internal temperature was probably in the low 50s, even with the fire in the hearth. I'd been so sure that there was no way the NPS, or the agency, or anyone else could figure out who'd been writing these posts. I didn't stop to consider that they didn't need to figure it out themselves. All they needed to do was start poking around at the rangers in various areas. See, there's no way that anyone who wasn't intimately familiar with this area could have identified it just by the details I'd given. I'd even made sure to change the names of places and alter the descriptions of some of the events a little, just to try to make it that much more impossible for anyone to figure out who exactly or where I was. In retrospect, my mistake was obvious. If I was trying to identify the source of these posts, I'd probably go directly to the rangers who knew the territory even better than I do. I made the mistake of thinking that my friendship with Rick was strong enough for him to look the other way, to cover my ass. See, the Witch's Lodge isn't really known by that particular name around here. I just made that up as an alias for its real one. But I'm sure Rick would have been able to identify it immediately by reading what I'd written about it. The same goes for the other stories, too. And I'm also pretty sure that the other rangers would be able to recognize them for what they really were. Now that I'm really thinking about it, shit, I fucked up good this time. Okay, so here's the deal. There are things that happen out here, more than I've told anyone about, more than I was ever planning on alluding to in these posts. Things that they do out here, and things they definitely do not want anyone to know about. I thought I was being so clever by sharing this with you all and disguising the details enough that they couldn't be deciphered and traced back to me. Shit. Rick tilted his head at me and gave me one of those looks that told me he wasn't in the mood for any games right now. You know the stories I'm talking about, John, he said in a flat tone. The ones that I've told you time and again were a bad idea. The ones that I told you were going to get you into trouble. I tried to shrug it off, downplay it. Hell, they were just a few stories on the internet, Rick. I was just having a little fun. Gets lonely out here. We go stir-crazy sometimes. You know that. Yeah, well, these little stories have stirred up trouble for us both, he said, settling his hat on the chair and turning away from me, back towards the fireplace. They know who wrote them. They know who you are. I just stood there in shocked silence, mouth hanging open as I stared at my friend's back. Sudden comprehension flooded my thoughts. My eyes grew wide. You told them? I asked, stunned. How could I have been so naive? Rick had a job to do. We all had jobs to do out here. We all had people we answered to. We all knew the score. He didn't turn to face me, but I could see his head fall a little in resignation. His face was probably twisted up in frustration at my recklessness, at the position I'd put him in, if I had to guess. I hope there was a little regret there, too. I'd like to think that our friendship had been real enough. What did you expect? That they'd just look the other way again? This isn't the first time you pulled this shit, John, he said, glancing over his shoulder at me. I could see the darkness in his eyes in that brief moment, the resolve that had turned his features to stone, and I knew what was coming. The crackling of the flames from the fireplace almost covered the quiet sound of a fastener being unsnapped, but not quite. He was quick, but I had the advantage. Before he even had the chance to spin around to face me, my magnum was out of its holster and thundering with unimaginable violence in the small confines of the cabin. The air filled with acrid smoke, and the after-image of the muzzle flash glowed in my eyes, superimposed over the dim firelight. Rick staggered to his left, his own handgun falling to the floor, as he reached up to clench the blackened hole in the chest of his jacket, which was now already growing red from the terrible wound beneath. He looked up at me, and I could see the realization in his eyes of what had just happened. He reached out to steady himself against the mantel, gasping for breaths that now had a horrible wet rattle to them. "I'm sorry, Rick," I said, grabbing my pack from beside the door and slinging my rifle over my shoulder with trembling hands. "I screwed it all up. I'm sorry about all this." He didn't hear me, though. He had slumped to the floor and now stared vacantly at nothing, his blood pooling and spreading from beneath him across the wooden planks. He was gone. That was this morning. I took off out of my cabin as quickly as I could and strapped my pack onto the snowmobile. Within a couple minutes, I was speeding along the northern trail away from my cabin and in the direction of the decommissioned ranger station. I had killed my friend. He would have killed me if I hadn't acted first, I know. But that doesn't change anything. I've never used my gun to kill anything, man or beast. It was almost something that was there if I needed it, like a security blanket. But I never really thought I'd have to pull the trigger on anything. Shit. I've made a mess of this whole thing. I thought it was all over for me when I skirted a little too close to the edge back in Montana. But fortune had smiled on me, and the powers that be decided to give me another chance then. There wouldn't be another pardon for me this time. I'm sitting here in the back room of the old ranger station. I've concealed my snowmobile around back, covered by a tarp and whatever snow I could throw over top. It's starting to snow again outside, so I'm hoping that my tracks will be obscured before too long. Maybe it will buy me some time, just enough time to get some of this out there. To allow me to post some of the truth. I have no delusions about my capabilities. I'm just a caretaker. My training was cursory at best. I'm certainly no match for their teams. My name, my real name, is John Wright. I do actually work for the U.S. government, but not for the National Park Service. At least, not really. I'm not going to name the organization that I work for. Not because I'm afraid that they'll find out, it's too late for that now, but because the Raptor AI protocols will identify and censor this entire post before it has a chance to proliferate if I do. Once the post gets out and starts bouncing around to various servers, it's much more difficult for them to make it go away. My job here is mostly what I've told you. That part's true, but that's mostly just busy work. My cover, if you will. Primarily, I'm responsible for keeping an eye out for trespassers who wander a little too close to their facilities, or things that have escaped from them, or unintended byproducts of whatever the fuck they're doing in there. I don't really know what goes on under the mountain, and I'm sure I wouldn't understand it even if I did. What I do know is that I'm pretty sure those cars that just appear out of nowhere, hundreds of miles from anywhere they have any business being, are from one of those byproducts. The shades. Hell, I don't know. Escapees, maybe. I don't even know what I hope to accomplish by writing all this right now. Maybe it's my way of trying to make it right. Maybe I just want to make sure there's something left of me for anyone to remember. When I posted here 3 years ago, I saw the entrance to the facility. It's about 10 meters from my cabin, bored directly into the base of a mountain. I have no idea how big it is inside or how many people are in there. But I know that there were a lot of big military helicopters flying in and out at the beginning of the seasons here. I assumed they were transporting researchers, equipment, or whatever. It just hit me that if Rick had shown up at my door a half hour earlier, I would have been just finishing my breakfast instead of fully geared up and ready to head out for the day. I wouldn't have had my holster strapped to my chest, and I'm certain I'd be the one lying in a pool of my own blood right now. Shit. Concentrate. Damn it. I don't have time for this. I don't know what the communication protocol was that Rick was supposed to follow after he took care of me, but I assume someone was waiting for his report to confirm that I'd been silenced. I have to believe that by now they know something has gone wrong. There's probably a team at my cabin right now. It hasn't been snowing long enough to cover my tracks, unfortunately, which means they'll probably have no trouble figuring out which direction I took. It's only a matter of time before they show up here. Then it's all over. Right now, I'm typing this on my notebook computer and relaying it through the Ranger Station communication network. I'm surprised they haven't locked down the firewalls yet. I fully expected to get cut off from the world once I got here. Small blessings, I guess. At least I can get this out there still. You've probably gathered by now that most of the Rangers around here aren't what they seem either. Some are, I think, but most are ex-military, special forces types recruited by the agency to provide security and make sure that the caretakers don't go off the reservation like I did. Rick was that way. His real name is Mike, by the way. I won't tell you his last name. I don't want him remembered as anything other than a hero. I'm the one that fucked this whole thing up. He was just doing his job, fulfilling his sworn commitment. He was an honorable man. That's how I want him remembered. My nerves are starting to get the better of me. I just took a look outside because I thought I heard something. I don't think they can get here this quickly, so I'm thinking it was just my imagination. Look, this isn't something isolated to Alaska. They have research facilities all over the U.S. The last one I was at was in Montana, but I know there are others spread across the states: Wyoming, Texas, Kentucky, South Dakota. Hell, they're everywhere. They like to build them in national parks, especially those with huge amounts of wilderness. It ensures a reasonable amount of privacy without drawing the sort of attention that places like Groom Lake and Cheyenne Mountain have. Those two places are basically tourist attractions at this point. But man, once they tried out Alaska, it was like they hit the jackpot. The whole area is so remote and uninhabited that they're virtually guaranteed isolation and secrecy to do whatever it is they're doing in there. Did I tell you about the man I found once, half integrated into a boulder? I don't think so. He was wearing a lab coat, but the only parts of him that were accessible were his right arm and shoulder and the back of his head. The rest of him was somehow inside of it. which was probably for the best. I'm sure he died pretty quickly. I called that one in, and they had a team out there within an hour. I left once they arrived, but when I came back a couple days later, the whole boulder was gone, and the landscape had been made to look like it had never been there. I'm talking about a rock the size of a small house. Just gone. The bear story is true, by the way. The only difference is that it was us who covered the whole thing up. That one scares the shit out of me because that thing is still roaming out here somewhere. They never were able to find it. Hell, they lost a dozen men just trying. Same story as the bears, by the way. We found the teams down near the runoff gully just standing there, dead. You've never seen a nightmare until you've seen a dozen armed corpses just frozen in place. By the time we found them, they weren't much more than gray skins stretched over tight skeletons. But there they stood, looking like some goddamn zombie army out of a horror movie. I saw it once, I think. The thing that did it. It was about the size of a tall, thin man, but the shape was all wrong. The joints bent in strange ways, and the head was something that reminded me of a praying mantis. It was covered in black and gray mottled skin that looked sort of like scales, but not quite. I don't know. I'm just a caretaker. I came across it while out making my rounds one day. It was clamped onto the back of one of those big grizzlies, arms and legs wrapped around it like it was some sort of monstrous insect or something. The bear was just standing there, making the most god-awful screams you've ever heard, like it was being burned alive or something. But it wasn't moving. It was just standing there, perfectly still, while this thing did whatever it was doing. Feeding on the bear, somehow, I guess. I hid behind a tree and nearly pissed myself. I thought for sure it was going to hear my panicked breathing and come for me next, but it didn't. Eventually, the bear stopped making that terrible crying sound and went quiet. A few minutes later, this thing unwraps itself from around the grizzly, takes a few steps toward a big pine tree, and just vanishes. Only, it didn't really vanish. I nearly stepped out from behind the tree to take a closer look at the bear when I realized it was still looking at that thing. Only its skin had camouflaged itself perfectly into the background, taking on the exact coloring and pattern of the snow-covered pine. I mean, perfectly. The only reason I was able to see it was because part of it, one of its appendages, I think, was still slightly protruding away from the tree. It was this break in the shape of the tree that caught my attention and probably saved my life. I must have stood there for another hour before it finally took a step away from that tree, its surface returning to the black and gray splashes of color. When it moved, it was like a stalking spider, slow and deliberate, graceful and ungainly all at the same time. It was a fucking nightmare, is what it was. It took a few steps closer to the bear. Like it was trying to figure out whether this was some sort of new prey or whether it was something already used up. Like it had forgotten about it and was just looking for its next meal. After that, it glided down the trail without a sound, thankfully in the opposite direction of my hiding spot. I waited another hour before daring to move an inch. And when I did, I hauled ass back to my cabin, locked the door, and radioed the whole thing into Mike. They sent a team out, but never found anything other than the bear, which they very quickly made disappear. While I'm sharing my sins, by the way, the real rangers, the ones that originally found the dead bears and reported it to the NPS, well, you won't find them anymore. There were 3 of them that worked with the researchers, just like I said in my story. But a week after the researchers left, all 3 of those rangers somehow wandered off trail during a snowstorm and died of hypothermia. Yeah, right. Hypothermia. You'd think that the agency could at least use a little imagination when they come up with these stories. I know this whole thing took a sudden sharp right turn on you guys, and I'm sorry about that. I'm out of time, though. No more time for pretexts or lies. The bottom line is, you're better off staying out of the parks. Go see a movie. Go for a drive. Play video games. Whatever. I suppose even state parks are probably safe enough, but I wouldn't chance it. The shit I've seen. What they've done. Okay, I'm pretty sure that wasn't my imagination that time. Time to upload the post. If I'm mistaken and I have more time, I'll just send an update. But I want to make sure this gets out there before they stop it. I've been a fire lookout for about a year now. I spend most of my life alone in a small, window-lined, one-room shack atop a steel and wood-frame tower in the middle of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. My only companions are my collection of cheap novels, a laptop computer with infrequent and unreliable internet service, and the two-way radio I use to communicate with the few nearby towers and ranger stations. Nearby is a bit of a misnomer, though. Using my high-powered binoculars, I can just barely make out Tower 12 on a clear day, situated several miles to my west. Tower 15, the next nearest to my location, only appears as a glint of sunlight to my east when the sun catches it just right. I've been told the Parks Department intends to put up some additional towers in this area as soon as it gets the necessary funding, which is probably no time soon. That's fine with me, though. I like the solitude. It helps quiet my mind, keeps the memories at bay. Mostly, I occupy my days either with simple maintenance in and around the tower or scanning the dense trees all around me for any signs of trouble. It's been a dry year, so the threat of fire is a constant one. This particular afternoon, I was clearing some brush from around the base of the tower that had begun to encroach on the fire road leading back to the nearby ranger station 20 miles away. Even with the heavy suspension of the government-issued Jeep, the road was a harsh ride at the best of times. I had just finished dragging some brush cuttings off into the tree line when the radio clipped to my belt squawked. Tower 9. This is Tower 12. Do you copy? It was Billy Johnson, my supervisor. Nice enough guy, I suppose. Tended to leave me alone most of the time. I straightened up and stretched my back, wiping the sweat from my eyes with my forearm and keyed the microphone attached to my shoulder. Go for Tower 9, I replied as I replaced the shears and bow saw into the small storage shed near the base of the stairs. John, do you have eyes on a bit of smoke north of your position? Stand by, Billy, I said, snatching up my water bottle and jogging to the metal staircase that wound its way around the tower. I didn't bother locking the 8-foot chain-link fence surrounding my little compound. Chances were, I'd be back soon enough. Reaching the top, I stepped through the trapdoor and onto the walkway that circled the cabin, closing it behind me. It was habit at this point. The last thing I needed was to take an errant step and tumble down through the open hatch. I'd probably end up breaking my neck. As I passed by, I reached into the open door of the shack and grabbed the binoculars hanging on a nearby hook. Rounding the railed corner of the walkway and turning my attention to the dark green blanket of trees stretching out before me, I saw the smoke almost instantly. A thin trickle of wispy white haze rose lazily above the canopy some distance off. Probably just some campers, I figured, though there weren't any approved campsites in that area. We always had more than a few folks each season who decided that camping off-trail in the deep bush sounded like quite a hoot. Most of them come back just fine, oblivious to the danger that this wilderness presents to anyone not adequately prepared. Some of them have to be brought out by search and rescue. Some of them just don't come back. A ranger or a random hiker might occasionally come across the deserted remains of a campsite and report it in. Those are the spooky ones, the ones where people just vanished and left behind a perfectly set-up campsite. No explanation, no clues, just a deserted clearing, often with perfectly intact tents and personal effects. But there are bears and mountain lions, along with a handful of lesser predators that roam these forests, and sometimes they get hungry enough to stalk and even kill humans. And that doesn't even take into consideration the much more likely scenario. Folks stepping out of their tents at night to take a piss and very quickly getting lost. Most humans aren't suited to survival in the wilderness, unfortunately. My radio squawked again. Tower 9, what's the word? Yeah, I see it, Billy. Looks to be a couple of miles due north of my tower. What's your plan? He asked. I knew what he meant. Keep an eye on it and hope for the best, or take a trip over and investigate. After a brief pause, I sighed with resignation. It's probably just a campfire, but I guess I better head over and take a look to be sure. I didn't relish the thought of trekking to that area of wilderness, to be honest. It was the only area I hadn't explored during my time here. There weren't many trails heading in that direction, and the ones that did were badly overgrown and too narrow for the Jeep. A couple of miles hike might not seem like a lot, but when you're out here alone, the dense trees seem to stretch on forever. 2 miles can feel like 100. "Roger that, John," Billy replied. "Take your pack and your rifle. Check in periodically." "Will do. Tower 9 out," I said, replacing the binoculars on their hook and shouldering the red canvas backpack waiting dutifully in the corner chair. I grabbed the rifle from its rack over the doorframe, checked to make sure it was loaded, and headed out. As I locked the gate behind me, I threw my pack in the back of the Jeep and set the rifle beside it. The Jeep wouldn't get me too far before the brush made the trail impassable, but if it saved me even half a mile of hiking, it was well worth it. The sun was still high in the sky. I had plenty of time to get there and back before dusk, as long as I didn't dawdle. I started the engine and turned the wheels toward the unmaintained trail to my right. After only a few moments, the trees and canopy obscured any trace of the watchtower behind me. I was actually able to push the Jeep farther than expected, a pleasant surprise. I was probably a mile along the trail before it bent, and a massive pine lay across the path, much too large to go over. The dense underbrush around me ruled out the possibility of going around. I immediately lamented not bringing the chainsaw. Cutting it up and winching the pieces out of the way wouldn't have been too difficult and would have saved me a ton of trouble. With a quiet curse, I stepped out of the Jeep and grabbed my gear from the back seat. I smiled to myself as a quote from a certain fictional adventure-seeking archaeologist suddenly came to mind. "We walk from here." Making sure to mark the location of the Jeep on my handheld GPS, I stepped over the thigh-high tree trunk and continued along the path. According to my earlier estimate, the trail was heading in the direction of the smoke, which was a blessing in my book. The less time I had to spend bushwhacking, the better. The trail continued to narrow, as I expected, and before long, I was brushing branches and leaves with my shoulders as I walked. The trees, which had been alive with the cheering and chirping of animal life near the tower, now seemed muted. The forest around me was growing denser, feeling oddly claustrophobic at times. Billy checked in a few times, and I updated him on my progress, promising to maintain regular contact. He advised me that a weather relay from the ranger station had reported an approaching storm, likely to reach us before nightfall. A quick glance at my watch made me wince. I had already spent more time than I'd predicted. Maybe it was best to turn around and head back. The last thing I wanted was to get caught out here overnight with minimal supplies and a rainstorm. I wasn't worried, but it sure wouldn't be comfortable. If I'd been farther from my destination, I probably would have turned back right then. I wish I had. Within another 20 minutes, however, I smelled the faint scent of a wood fire. Not strong, but definitely there. I was even more certain of what I'd find when I reached them. When I stepped out of the now almost non-existent trail, I found myself in a sparsely treed area amidst a dozen or so wooden shacks, and I halted in surprise. I had reached the base of a hilly rise covered in heavy forest, and these old, forgotten cabins looked like they had belonged to some sort of small settlement. Perhaps an old logging camp, I thought. I didn't know this place even existed, and made a mental note to research it when I got back to my tower. I keyed the microphone. "Tower 12, this is John. Do you copy?" Billy replied, his voice staticky and distant. "Hey, John, Tower 12, what's your status?" I frowned and looked around at the towering trees all around me. I suppose I was asking more out of the portable radio than was reasonable. I was lucky I still had any signal at all. "I found what looks like an old logging or trapping camp," I said, meandering among the decaying and derelict cabins. Most had collapsed roofs and were barely standing. "The campfire has to be nearby. I'm going to take a look around a bit more." There was a pause before Billy spoke again. What's your current location, John? I glanced at my handheld GPS and relayed my position. Another pause. John, I think you should probably just turn back. Come back, okay? You don't have many more hours of daylight left, and that storm looks like it's getting worse. Something in his voice sounded off, but I couldn't quite place it. Nervous, maybe? I couldn't blame him. My safety was his responsibility, and the idea of one of his lookouts being caught out in a storm overnight probably didn't sit well. Coincidentally, it didn't sit well with me either. You may be right, Billy, I replied, turning around and casting my eyes over the area. I'll just head. I stopped as my eyes caught sight of a bright yellow nylon tent just beyond the last of the structures. Repeat your last, John. I didn't get that. Stand by. Tower 12, I said absently, making my way toward what I now realized was a small cluster of 3 modern tents situated around a central fire ring. The fire had been completely extinguished, but the embers still smoldered lowly, the source of the smoke. I looked around for the campers. Nothing. No one in sight or earshot. Sleeping bags and electric lanterns were still inside the tents, though I couldn't find any backpacks or supplies. Hello? I called out, turning in a circle. I'm with the Forest Service. Is anyone here? Nothing. Just the muted echo of my own voice. I was about to dump some dirt on the remaining embers of the campfire and call it a day when I noticed the narrow footpath leading toward the slope. In the soft dirt were clearly recent footprints heading away from the camp. I keyed the mic again. Tower 12, this is John. I found the source of the smoke. It's a campfire, all right? Nothing to be concerned about, Billy answered almost immediately. Roger that, John. Head back home. I paused a moment, curiosity pulling me toward the footpath. I'll be heading back shortly, Billy. Just want to check something out first. I wouldn't screw around out there, John, Billy replied, an edge to his voice. Better head back now so you can beat the storm. His last sentence didn't exactly sound like a suggestion. Something had him rattled. I hesitated before answering. Acknowledged, I said, knowing full well I was going to check out the path before heading back. Still, I didn't feel like arguing with my supervisor over something so small. Just a quick walk up that path, then I'd be on my way. This path was even less established than the one I'd been on earlier, but I could clearly see the campers' imprints in the dirt as I went. Before long, I emerged into a small clearing, eyes widening with yet another unexpected discovery. The rough-hewn timber that framed the entryway was set into the near vertical slope of the hillside before me. It created a dark tunnel entrance that had clearly been sealed off with a heavy iron gate many years ago, likely by the Park Service to keep inquisitive hikers from falling to their deaths in an old, abandoned mine shaft. So it had been a mining camp, not a logging one. I didn't know there were any mines near here. Hell, I wasn't even sure what they could have been mining for. Coal? Maybe gold? Did they even have gold mines in Tennessee? Who knows? Certainly not me. Clearly, regardless, now that gate stood wide on its hinges, the remains of a rusted chain and antique padlock lying in the dirt nearby. Hell, I couldn't just turn around and leave. One of these dumbass campers had decided it'd be fun to explore a closed and restricted mine entrance. This is Tower 12. This is John D. Reed. Billy probably wouldn't be happy that I'd continued my exploration after he told me to head back, but there was nothing to do about it now. I wasn't equipped or trained for any sort of cave exploration or rescue. The Rangers had very specialized teams for that sort of thing. But I could at least poke my head inside and see if there were any campers, or hear them, confirm if they went inside. No answer from the radio. I tried again, with the same results. I tried a different approach. Tower 15, this is John from Tower 12. Do you copy? I said into the radio. I figured I might be able to at least get Nathan's attention if I was out of range of Billy. Tower 12. There was a burst of static that sounded like it might have contained the hint of a human voice, but it was too distorted and distant to make anything out. There was only a moment of indecision before I made up my mind. I knew it was reckless going into the mine, especially when my supervisor believed I was currently on my way back to the tower. but I had this nagging intuition that something might be wrong with the whole situation. Maybe someone was hurt and needed help. I couldn't just leave them there, knowing that I might be their only chance of rescue. In retrospect, I should have turned back and called it in to the ranger station. They could have mobilized the search and rescue teams that specialized in cave rescues. I should have. But I didn't. I pulled my powerful LED flashlight from my pack, turned it on, and headed into the pitch-black darkness of the mine entrance. The walls and floor had been smoothly carved many years ago, which made my footing uneventful, and the tunnel itself was mostly a straight shot. Several times during the first few minutes, I turned back to watch the bright square of daylight at the entrance gradually shrink to a pinpoint of light. By the time I'd taken the first dogleg turn of the tunnel, I was in complete darkness. It was a very strange feeling, oppressive almost. At one point, I turned off my flashlight experimentally, but after only a few seconds, I quickly flicked it back on. In that short time, my heart had been pounding in my chest, and some primal fear had begun growing inside me. It took a moment to calm myself. The darkness was absolute. It was almost as if you could feel it pressing in on you. My footsteps seemed much louder than they should have on the dirt floor, and the air was growing cold and damp the further I went. After another 100 feet or so, the smoothly carved tunnel ended abruptly in a wall of rubble. I couldn't tell if it was a cave-in at some point, or if this was simply where the miners stopped digging and hadn't bothered to remove the debris. But either way, it certainly appeared to be the end of the line. And then I saw it. I almost missed it because of the way the light and shadows played over the head-sized rocks strewn before me. But when I looked closer, I realized I was looking at a ragged hole in the wall. It was only 5 feet across or so, and definitely didn't look like the deliberate formation of the tunnel I was standing in now. It almost looked like the miners had broken into a natural void of some sort. Interesting. But there was no way in hell I was going in there. I was definitely not trained or outfitted for any sort of spelunking trip, and it didn't seem the sort of thing suited to the learn-as-you-go method. Just as I was turning back to make my way out of the mine, I heard the distant sound of voices echoing from the opening in the stone wall. The sound was faint, and may have just been my imagination, but I didn't think so. "Hello?" I called, pressing my face into the black abyss of the hole. "Can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you." Nothing. The air from beyond the breach was cold and smelled stale. Old. Wrong. It felt as if I didn't belong here. None of us did. There was a long moment of unbroken silence, and then I heard a voice again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that?" it said, presumably to a companion. It sounded like a young woman, nervous, uncertain. "Hello? Someone there?" That settled it for me. I carefully crawled through the opening into the space beyond. Shining my light around, I found myself in a small natural chamber, maybe 30 feet across, with an uneven ceiling of jagged rock that barely cleared my head. The first thing that caught my attention was the cracked lantern lying on the ground. It looked old. Very old. Maybe 100 years or more. A thick layer of grime and age covered its soot-blackened surface, and the glass was thick and uneven. Beside the askew lantern was a small leather-bound book, partially buried in the dirt and dust, with a moldering leather strap securing it closed. It looked like a journal. And without a thought, I tucked it into my backpack. Raising my light back up, scanning around the room. "Hello?" I called again. I didn't hear the voices anymore, but the narrow beam of my flashlight illuminated another tunnel in the far corner of this room, mired in darkness. "Can you hear me?" Once again, I got that feeling that something wasn't right. Then the voice came again. Closer this time. "Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here?" she asked, her voice trembling with apprehension. I hesitated, frowning. Something didn't seem right about the voice, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Before I could summon my words to respond, another voice called out. This time, it was clear. The voice of a young man. "We can hear you moving around in there. Please help us. We're lost, and our friend is hurt." "Hear me moving around in there?" I was shouting to them. I sure as hell wasn't trying to hide. Could they not hear me for some reason? I stepped forward to the secondary tunnel and raised my voice again. I'm with the Forest Service. It was then, when I reached out to steady myself against the wall of the tunnel entrance, that my hand met something wet, and I recoiled in disgust, thinking I had just grabbed a handful of some subterranean slime. When I shone my light on it, however, it became very clear the reality was far worse. Blood. I stepped back, trying to keep the panic that was fighting to take control of my rationality at bay. I needed to keep a level head, for now. Panning my light around, I saw an astonishing amount of blood painting the wall and floor in front of me. Somebody had definitely been hurt, and badly. With blood loss like this, I wasn't sure I'd be able to stabilize them long enough to get rescue in here. What the hell happened here? And why did the hikers continue into the cave after one of them was injured this badly? Unless they lost their light and got turned around, there was no way for them to get lost. There hadn't been any branches to this tunnel since I first entered. All they had to do was turn around and walk until they saw daylight. The man's voice called again, colored with the unmistakable tinge of fear. What the hell is that? Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand. He seemed to be getting closer. At least if I could guide them to my voice, maybe I could get them out of here. Get to higher ground. Radio for rescue evac. They had a helicopter permanently stationed at the main ranger station. It could be here in 20 minutes if I was able to reach them. The woman's voice came again, and this time I froze. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? All at once, it hit me. The indescribable unease I had been mostly successful in repressing now fought back with renewed vigor. I realized in that moment what I had missed previously. The woman had repeated herself, twice now. No change in her inflection, no variation in emotion or urgency. It was exactly the same, down to the syllable. It was like I was listening to a recording. Did you hear that? Hello? Is someone in here? Repeated the male voice, now even closer. Hurry up, Becky. Take my hand. Below the words, I could hear the stealthy sliding of something over rocks. It seemed like it wasn't too far beyond the tunnel entrance now, but I wasn't going to wait for it to emerge from the darkness. I didn't think that what I'd see emerge from the darkness would be a couple of college kids who'd had a rough time of it during a weekend camping trip. Allowing my panic to run free, I turned and threw myself through the cave breach and landed roughly on the flat stone floor of the mine shaft. Beyond skinning my hands to hell and banging my knee on a rock, scrambling my feet with a hiss of pain, I ran as fast as I could, not realizing until I finally burst into the waning light of the late afternoon that I had lost my rifle somewhere in that cave. It was darker than it was when I first entered the mine, and a quick glance to the sky showed the angry black thunderheads that had moved in, as promised, much faster than I had expected. I quickly swung the iron gate closed on screeching hinges and looped the chain between the bars as tightly as I could, securing it rather lamely with the hasp of a broken padlock. I stood there for a long moment, bent over with my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath outside the mine entrance when I felt the first drops of the coming storm on the back of my neck. I straightened and looked through the bars of the gate into the ominous darkness beyond, realizing how ridiculous my barricade really was. It wouldn't do much good if something tried to get out, but at least it made me feel a little bit better. At least it made me feel a little bit better until I heard the voice echoing from the mine shaft. Peh, getting closer. It was unmistakable. Uncanny. Hello, can you hear me? I'm with the Park Service. I'm here to help you. By the time dawn arrived the next morning, I had climbed down from my temporary shelter in the low boughs of the red cedar and tried to work out all the painful kinks from my stiff shoulders and neck. The night had not been kind to me, but I was alive, which is more than my fiercest mind expected after yesterday. The night had been harrowing. There was no better word to describe it. The rain hissed among the trees and stung exposed skin angrily. driven by the banshee wail of the wind rushing through the forest, accentuated by the chaotic flashing of lightning and the heart-stopping crack of thunder. Because of this relentless chaos, it's difficult to say with any certainty. But throughout the night, I thought I heard something large trying to move stealthily in the forest near my shelter. I say, trying, because it felt like whatever stalked through the underbrush was more at home in the unnatural, Stygian gloom of a cave than under the watchful eyes of nature. Of course, it could just as easily have been my imagination. In the first dim light of dawn, as it started to illuminate the sodden and dripping forest, I spent the better part of 20 minutes straining my eyes with every ounce of concentration as I scanned the gray woodlands around me. I was only 10 feet or so above the ground, but there was no way I was going to step foot from my hide until I was absolutely certain that I was alone. Once I was satisfied, I was alone for the moment. I climbed down to the muddy ground. I tried the radio several times through the night and into the morning, but wasn't able to get even a burst of static that might indicate someone trying to respond. A combination of the storm and interference from the trees worked against me. My first thought was to get back to my Jeep as quickly as possible and run every drop of gas out of its tank, trying to get as far away from this place as I could. When I checked the GPS to see how close I was to its marked position, however, I found the unit unresponsive, with a disastrous crack across the screen that seemed to mock my dismay, probably caused by my less than graceful scramble from that damned cave. A rifle? No radio? No GPS. Perfect. I still had a compass and the rising sun to guide me, though, and that was something. I was only a couple miles from my tower, which should have been somewhere due south of where I stood. I knew that once I got close, I should be able to either find the service road or the tower itself, so there wasn't much danger of getting myself lost, at least. It was a small comfort, but one I gladly took. I moved through the trees and undergrowth with more speed and recklessness than I probably should have. An ankle broken by an errant misstep would have been bad news. Still, even though I hadn't heard or seen anything of my late-night visitor, I couldn't help but feel I was being watched. Do you know that creeping sense of dread you feel when you've just turned off the lights in the basement and now have to climb the stairs back to the light of the doorway? Or when you're making your way from your car in a dark and lonely parking lot? The feeling that something is there, something much more suited to the dark than you are? It's that same feeling that pushed my footsteps almost to a jog as I traversed the uneven ground and storm-felled trees that tried to hinder my passage. For the next hour, I moved at this pace, aware of every rasping lungful of breath, knowing that I should pause and rest for a few minutes, as pushing myself to fatigue would only increase my chances of falling or hurting myself. I imagined myself lying in blinding pain next to an unseen chuck hole, clutching at a broken leg and watching as the sunlight began to dim with the onset of dusk, waiting for whatever hunted my trail to find me. What would happen? Would I even have time to look on its visage before it struck? Did those campers in the cave? A misstep and a stumble that nearly made this nightmare a self-fulfilled prophecy jarred me back to the present. Against all instinct, I forced my pace to slow, first to a trot, then to a walk, and then reluctantly, I stopped completely, trying to catch my breath while I scanned the dense woodland around me. Nothing. No. Not nothing. As my heart began to slow and my breathing returned to a more manageable cadence, I turned my gaze back in the direction I had been headed, and an unconscious smile found its way to my lips. The sun had risen high in the morning sky during my flight, and now I caught a flash of its reflection on the windows of my tower, not 200 yards directly ahead of me. I laughed aloud with relief, fully aware that this fear-tinted eruption was closer to the manic cackle of lunacy than anything else. I didn't care, though. My feet started forward on their own, quickly reaching a brisk pace. A few minutes later, I burst out of the trees into the maintained clearing surrounding my tower, feeling the full sunlight on my face for the first time since yesterday. Had it only been a day? It seemed like longer. I was so filled with relief that I didn't even register the fact that the forestry department Jeep sat parked near my fenced-in tower until I started entering the combination into the gate lock. The faded white 12 emblazoned on the corner of the windshield told me that it was Billy's Jeep, which wasn't much of a surprise. I realized after a moment, after not hearing back from him, that I was more surprised I hadn't returned to find an entire search and rescue team making preparations to search for their lost puppy. I punched the 4-digit code into the mechanical combination lock on the gate and stepped through, making sure to close and lock it behind me. I stood there for a moment, staring through the tall chain-link fence at the dense tree line, wondering if something waited just out of sight in the shadows, staring back at me with hungry anticipation. I shook off the sudden chill as best as I could and made my way quickly to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Billy was going to be pissed at me, I was sure, but that thought was a fleeting one that didn't take purchase. His displeasure was the least of my concerns right now. When I reached the top, I threw open the trapdoor and suddenly found myself looking down the muzzle of a very large rifle. Even in that brief moment of abrupt shock, I could register how the barrel trembled in the hands of its agitated master, and I wondered how close I came to having my life ended in a brief flash of light. The moment only lasted a second or two, and then Billy hastily swung the rifle away in a safe direction. "Damn it, John," he exclaimed, his tone an incongruous mixture of relief and fear. "I almost shot you." I stepped fully through the trap door and let it close behind me. "Jesus, Billy," I breathed, leaning back against the railing. I suddenly felt weary and realized it was likely the adrenaline now rushing through my system that had kept me moving at such a hurried pace throughout the morning. "Where the hell have you been?" he demanded, stepping back inside my shack and taking a chair at the small table in the center of the room. I noted with mild interest that he kept the rifle leaning against the table beside him instead of stowing it in the rack over the door, but decided not to comment on it. Billy Johnson was in his middle years, maybe 45 or so, with a bit of a gut and grayish-brown hair, trimmed clothes. He wore an impressive mustache that reminded me of something an Old West gunslinger might sport. He was dressed in typical attire, khaki Forest Service shirt and brown cargo pants. In addition to the rifle, I had had the unfortunate opportunity to closely examine a moment earlier. I noticed that he wore his .500 Magnum in a holster at his side. That wasn't too unusual. When in the bush, bears and mountain lions can sneak up on you unawares. Having a hand cannon within easy reach goes a long way toward taking the fight out of them if necessary. It was a little unusual for a drive over to another tower, I suppose, but not exceptionally so, given the circumstances. I took the opposite chair, dropping my pack to the floor next to me. I realized my legs were still shaking anxiously and placed my hands on my knees to try to calm them. He was trying to deflect, but he was horrendously bad at it. He knew something. I was sure of it. "You know where I've been," I replied, gambling on instinct. I watched his face closely for a reaction and wasn't disappointed when he winced and turned his focus out the window and over the forest to the north. "I told you to abort and head back to your tower," he stated brusquely. "But you just had to feed that curiosity of yours, didn't you? You're damn lucky to be alive, you know that?" From my chair, I reached under the cupboard to my right and pulled a half-empty bottle of Jameson and a couple of mostly clean glasses. Billy turned his head and raised an inquisitive eyebrow. Alcohol was a no-no up here, but when I poured and handed him one of the glasses, he accepted it without a word. I took a pull from the other. "It's my own damn fault, I suppose," he continued, turning back fully to me. "It's been so long since anyone's even thought of Camp LeClaire that it didn't even click for me when you told me where you saw the campfire." I took another drink and then poured a bit more of the whiskey. "Camp LeClaire," I repeated. "That old mining camp?" "Logging camp, actually," he corrected me. "The mine was there long before the East Atlantic Logging Company set up out there. Nobody knows who dug it. Hell, Nobody even knows when it was dug, a long time before the 19th century at least. Camp LeClaire was established in 1872, and the mine was old even before that. He looked at me in earnest for the first time since I'd returned and frowned. You look like hell, John. Got caught in the storm, I'm guessing. Hell of a storm. I only raised my eyebrows as if to say, what an understatement. Billy nodded knowingly and took another swallow. Did you find the campers at least? I shook my head and turned to look out the window to the north, where I could almost envision the black void of that mine entrance staring back at me. No, I said softly. I tracked them to the mine but lost them in the cave. I jumped when Billy's glass hit the floor, and he was out of his chair before I even realized it. Billy hadn't moved from his seat, but now both hands were splayed on the table before him as if to steady himself. His pale blue eyes were wide and fixed on me. You went into the cave? He said, a sudden and horrifying realization dawning on him. It was then I realized my mistake. He hadn't known. He thought I had just discovered the camp and the mine, and then got caught in the storm overnight. A close call, but nothing that couldn't be undone. Yeah, I replied, nodding slowly, deliberately. Yeah, I went into that cave looking for the campers. The gate had been cracked open already. I'm not sure by whom or when. I leaned forward in my chair and stared hard at him. Billy, there's something in there. I think it got those campers. I think it followed me out. Billy Johnson's face had gone white then, and I thought for a moment he might pass out. He scooped his glass up from the floor with numb fingers and poured himself another splash of whiskey, downing it in one gulp. When he spoke again, it sounded far away and distant. Utami, he muttered. That's what the Chickasaw called it, and they were here long before we ever were. Blur is what the white man called it, among other names, Kuatami. He nodded. False brother, lying man, something like that. Hell, I don't know. What do I look like, a translator? It means bad, he continued. No matter what language you speak, it means something's out there that isn't supposed to be, something that was locked away a long time ago and forgotten. It was then that he stood and grabbed his rifle, as if suddenly remembering something. I need to get back to my tower and make a call now. I gestured to the radio base station sitting patiently on the table near the door. Why not use mine? Billy shook his head. Sorry, John. It doesn't work that way. Special phone, special number. I just hope I'm not too late. I started to stand. I'll go with you, I said. He pointed a stern finger at me and narrowed his eyes. No, you stay here, strap on your handgun, and make sure it's loaded. His voice was calm, almost cold, and didn't leave much room for debate. Still, I had no desire to stay alone with whatever this angler thing was roaming around out here. Billy, I can go with you. I can help. I started to argue, but it was quickly cut off when he took a menacing step toward me. And I realized quickly how much I'd underestimated him because of his normally easy manner. You will stay in your goddamn tower, and you will follow orders, he roared. I took an unconscious step back and reclaimed my seat, only managing a shaking nod in agreement. He took a trembling breath, pointed at the radio, and said in a slightly less terrifying tone, "And keep that thing on. As soon as I'm back at my tower, I'll radio you with updates." A moment later, he was gone, and the trapdoor slammed shut behind him. I stood and retrieved the Pelican case from under my cot. Inside was the same model of .500 Magnum revolver that Billy had been wearing, heavy and cold in my hands. I loaded it and belted it on the leather holster, feeling the reassuring weight tugging at my waist. "John?" I heard Billy call from below. I went outside to the walkway, leaning over the railing. He was standing beside his Jeep, 50 feet below, shielding his eyes from the bright sunlight as he looked up at me. "Make sure to keep everything locked. I'll come back for you," he shouted. I raised a hand to him and slid the latch shut on the trapdoor with my toe. I turned back into my shack as I heard Billy's Jeep fire up, and a moment later, it drove off down the rough service road toward his tower. I glanced back to the north, to the place where I had first seen the campfire smoke rising the day before, and suppressed a shudder. I was alone again, safe in my tower and armed, but alone. Abruptly, like an unexpected wave of nausea, the feeling that I was being watched washed over me with a chill, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I looked back over my shoulder to where Billy had been only a minute before, but saw only the rough service road and dense, impenetrable tree line beyond. That's probably just my imagination, but the feeling didn't diminish, and with every passing breath, I was more and more certain that there was something nearby, just out of sight, standing stone still in the gray-green foliage, waiting. I stood there a long moment, eyes straining for any hint of movement or alien shape among the shadows. But if there was, my human eyes weren't sharp enough to pick it out. I stepped back through the open doorway of my shack and dropped down into the chair again, my eyes catching the bottle of whiskey before me. I was tempted to pour another drink to help settle my nerves, but I could already feel the tickle of a buzz at the edges of my mind from what I'd already drunk, and quickly decided that was the last thing I needed for my reflexes and awareness to be dulled right now. I'd made more than one poor decision in the last 24 hours, and I didn't think adding another to the pile was such a great idea. Grabbing the bottle, I screwed the cap back on and reached to return it to the sparse cover to my right. As I did so, my boot caught my pack, knocking it over. Without a thought, I reached down to move it out of the way, and then remembered the old weather journal tucked inside the front pocket, the one I'd found in the cave. I reached into the unzipped front pocket. For a frustratingly alarming moment, my searching hand couldn't feel anything in the compartment, and I feared that I'd lost it in my chaotic escape. But then my fingers brushed the familiar shape, and I withdrew it, setting it in front of me on the table. I could see the book much more clearly now in the daylight. It wasn't overly large. A little larger than my hand, and maybe the thickness of my thumb. There were no markings on the front except for a simple, grimy brass loop that secured the leather strap holding it closed. I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was inside, but I needed some answers. Anything. A stray sound from the trees below rose to my ears, and I froze, listening intently for more, but none came. The forest around me was silent again, and I turned my attention back to the journal, pulling the strap free from the cover and turning to the front page. From the pocket of Andrew Robinson, it said. The writing was neat and compact and distinctly male. The ink was a rich black, scrawled upon brittle yellow pages, and though faded with the years, was still mostly legible. I turned to the next page, where the entries began. I felt as though I had dropped into his account midway, as though this was just the latest in a series of journals that Andrew Robinson had been keeping. 23rd July, 1891. After nearly a week of hard overland trekking, we reached the abandoned camp late this afternoon, exactly where the old trapper said we would. Sequoia Arpani, tracker, has once again astonished me with his overland navigation skills. I must admit I was skeptical at the Yar in the old tavern, spun the crowded confines of the common house in Dun Creek, especially after I smelled the liquor on his breath. But the professor never gathered a moment. The man's instincts for reading human character are absolutely singular. The camp looks to have been abandoned, and I have to admit a certain unease as we inspected the rough cabins. There isn't a soul to be found, and it looks years abandoned, yet everything stands as if awaiting the loggers' return at any moment. Strange. 24th July, 1891. Our small troop, both intrepid adventurers, made camp in the center of LeClaire last night. Those cabins likely would have been more comfortable, but I doubt any of us would have felt at ease intruding upon them. Richards laughed it off when someone mentioned how peculiar it was that the loggers had departed in such a hurry that they abandoned their personal possessions. But I could see in his eyes that he felt it odd as well. Sequoia, our ever-courageous and solid guide, seemed ill at ease and unusually withdrawn, refusing all conversation and only responding in queries with quiet grunts. Something of concern hides behind his eyes, though, and I wonder what it is. Only the professor seems unmoved by the unusually still atmosphere of this place, and his typical infectious positivity keeps working at our unease. keeping it from expanding beyond its current state. Today, we spent much of the day exploring the area surrounding Camp Leclerc, and the sunlight was nearly spent when Dobson burst back into camp with news of his discovery. We all of us raced at a moment's notice behind him as he led us along an ill-used and nearly invisible footpath that led ever ascending upon the side of the northern rocky slope. When the path terminated, we were deposited before a truly curious sight, a barricaded tunnel entrance that had been bored into the rock face by some unknown hands. I suspect some sort of exploration tunnel or added dug-in search of precious ores, especially given the nation's more recent history with gold fever. The wooden barrier that had been roughly assembled from a hodgepodge of heavy timber beams was curious, and several of our group commented on it. But the professor dismissed the triviality, so the matter was dropped. It is far too late in the day to proceed any further, but we plan to penetrate the barricade and enter the tunnel in the morning. The excitement among the men is palpable. 25th July 1891. Sequoia is gone. He took his supplies and his prized Winchester rifle and fled sometime during the night like a phantom. This is a shocking blow to all of us, foreign to the professor, with whom the Pawnee Tracker had partnered for a number of years across much of the eastern states. We have no explanation for his sudden desertion, and it sits unwell with the entirety of the group. The overall mood has darkened, I fear. Still, we must push onward. 25th July 1891 addendum. It took more than 2 hours of hard labor, but we were finally able to gain entrance to the mine shortly before noon today. Richards managed to get his boot caught between two heavy timbers as he stumbled forward, straining his ankle with a terrible cry. We feared it broken, but Dr. Franklin assured us that his bones seemed intact. Regardless, Richards was taken back to the camp, where he will convalesce while the rest of us make our entry. His part in our exploration has come to an end for now. We made our way in a single file through the added tunnel for some way before reaching its carved end. The light from our oil lanterns providing regrettably inadequate illumination over the rocky surroundings. When we reached the terminus of the mine tunnel, our hearts sank for a moment before the professor gave an exclamation of discovery and suddenly disappeared through a nearly hidden rift in the wall, surrounded by jagged rocks. We eagerly followed him through, careful of our footing as we went, and found ourselves in what I can only assume to be an accidental breach by the miners into a natural cave system. The air was chill and unmoving, but our excitement over this discovery laid any concerns or discomfort this may have caused. The professor directed us to set up a secondary camp in this new chamber, which we'll use as a staging point for further exploration. So, we spent the rest of the day bringing supplies for our main camp and constructing a smaller version in this moderately sized chamber. By the time we completed this endeavor, the efforts of the day precluded the start of the exploration until the group has had the opportunity to rest and replenish their energy. I feel I will sleep well tonight despite the anxious excitement buzzing around my mind. 26th July, 1891. Another shock. When we woke this morning, O'Connor is gone. The Irishman, who has ever been reliable and constant as the North Star, was assigned first watch last night. There is no trace of him, and no indication that he took any provisions or even his personal rucksack with him. I fear his natural inquisitiveness may have gotten the best of him and led him to explore the deeper caverns beyond our ad hoc base camp, for his lantern is the sole item that has gone missing with his person. The professor immediately rallied the rest of our small group, 7 in all now, and mounted a search for our lost companion. I tried to caution him against rushing into action, but he was not to be deterred. To my dismay, I was the sole man ordered to remain here at camp, whilst my companions took up their supplies and launched deeper into the cave system in the event young O'Connor returned in their absence. I was understandably disappointed, but grasped the logic of it well enough. I would loathe to think of O'Connor returning only to find us all gone, and then losing himself again, trying to find us. I shall endeavor to rest a bit. With luck, my companions will return before long with our lost compatriot. 27th July 1891. I am at my wit's end, and I'm unsure how to proceed. It has been more than a day since the professor led the rest of the men in search of poor O'Connor, and I have felt their absence as keenly as I am aware of my own solitude in this cave. I've seen nothing of our missing companion or the party that delved deeper into the system yesterday morning, and I know their lanterns did not have sufficient fuel to carry them for this long without other means of illumination to guide their return. I fear they are hopelessly lost. I myself had to return to Leclerc for more lantern oil for my waning light. I must admit, with no little embarrassment and some reluctance, to my return to this dark place, which no longer carries any of its former adventurous excitement or fascination. It is now nothing more than a doorway into the deep places below the earth, where men were never intended to tread. But the growing apprehension is not the worst of it. The sounds, by heaven's grace, the sounds. I first became aware of them last night as I did my lantern and tried to set myself to sleep. At first, it was only an indistinct and muted echo, which may have been interpreted as nothing more than the distant whistle of wind or other natural sound distorted by the unique acoustics of this place. Then I heard the distinct tonal qualities that could only be a man's voice. I instantly rose and took my lantern, raising the flame and rushing to the entrance of the cave that swallowed my companions. There I stood, listening with such keen focus that I felt beads of sweat upon my brow. I would swear upon a holy book that it was the distant call of the professor himself, and I eagerly called back with as much fervor as I could summon, hoping desperately to guide them back to me. However, the instant I called out, the voices vanished, and I was met only with the suffocating silence of an open tomb. There I stood, straight as a sentinel, praying for a response from my friends. After several minutes of absolute silence, my thoughts began turning to dark things. I became painfully aware that anything beyond the weak cast of my lantern would be utterly invisible to me. But I, on the other hand, would be lighted as a beacon to it. I pushed these thoughts from my mind as forcefully as I could, inwardly chastising myself for seeing ghouls where none existed. I was about to call out again to my lost companions when I heard it. The voice came again, echoing from the claustrophobic abyss that lay before me, mired in the blackest darkness one could imagine. It was still some distance away, I estimated, but I was certain it seemed closer now. When the third time I heard it, I was just barely able to make out the words, but it was enough to be sure. My own words echoed back at me from the depths of that damned cave, and in my own voice, I staggered and nearly dropped the lantern. At that moment, could the legends be true? The professor always seemed to believe them, though I must admit I attributed his faith to the unwavering certainty he held in those things lost to antiquity. He'd always maintained that a legend, especially one whispered by so many indigenous people without mutual contact, must have some root in truth. But that line of reasoning is antithetical to modern civility, and I must reject it and focus on the more probable explanation that my already stressed nerves were turning my fears against me. The voices must be those of my companions, lost in the dark, but near enough to hear their calls. They must be. I'm not certain what lies next, but I know that I cannot abandon my companions, my friends, to wander the darkness until they fall from exhaustion or dehydration. Not while I might yet help them. I will leave this written account at the entrance to the cave. This lantern is nearly spent, but I have another with a full vessel that'll take its stead. If I do not return, at least someone may know of our passing here. May God be with us all. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, momentarily lost in what I just read. How is it possible? The journal was more than 130 years old. No animal alive then could be what pursued me now. What if it's not an animal? The sudden burst of static from Billy's call that simultaneously erupted from my radio base station and the portable handset clipped to my shoulder made me jump and drop the journal to the floor, heart pounding. I cursed under my breath and keyed the microphone. "Go for Tower 9, I answered, my voice tight as I spoke. My eyes drifted out across the sky to the east, where darkening thunderheads had been unknowingly gathering and marching slowly in my direction. I shook my head. Icing on the cake, I thought. "John, what's your position?" asked Billy, the self-assured authority that filled his tone now strangely absent, replaced with something else: fear. I frowned a moment at the question before answering. "What do you think, Billy? I'm in my tower, just like you told me." A strange pause before he spoke again. "John, this isn't some sort of joke, right? You're not outside my tower?" I was growing more agitated by the moment. What sort of question was that? I had no Jeep. There was no way I could have made it to his tower in such a short amount of time, even if I'd wanted to. "No, Billy," I answered with more force than I intended. "I'm not outside your tower." I stopped mid-sentence, a horrified realization sweeping over me. In that moment, I tried to speak, but my mouth had gone dry. "Billy," it was all I could muster. The radio was silent as my eyes slowly drifted to the west, where I could just make out the small, lonely shape of Tower 12. Barely visible over the darkening blanket of green. Was that a gunshot? Another night, another goddamn night stuck in this window-lined prism. At least I have a good view, so I guess that's something. The storm raged all night again last night, and only let up just before dawn. At one point, the winds were gusting hard enough to rock the tower, which was a bit disconcerting, to say the least. As I stand out on the wet catwalk around my shack, I see that the clouds haven't let us go just yet, and look every bit as pissed off as they did yesterday afternoon. It seems like the last dry season has come to an end, which is good since I've been slacking a bit on my fire-watching duties over the last couple of days. Gallows humor, right? Due to that, or I'm sitting in the corner in a fetal position crying. I've been told by my ex-fiancée that I'm not an attractive crier. I haven't heard Pete from Billy since his last terrifying broadcast to me yesterday. I tried to reach him several times since then, but no dice. I've also tried reaching Nathan and the ranger station, but all I get is static, even from my base radio set. When I first started here, I remember Billy telling me during my brief orientation that the radio should be able to reach out 50 miles or more, so I'm not sure what's going on with them. Update: I just took a quick look at the base station and found that the cable leading up to the antenna on the roof of the shack is now just a dangly thing swaying in the breeze. The storm must have decided it needed the antenna more than I did because it's gone. I can see where the screws were torn out of the wooden mast, and before you say anything about whatever this thing is that's been stalking around and deciding to sabotage my radio, I should probably tell you that the wooden antenna mast looks like it's been around for a long time. The wood was probably dry rotted to begin with, and now that it's soaked, it's crumbled away into little wet brown bits as soon as I probed it with my fingers. Speaking of whatever this Kwatami or angler thing is, and I'm just going to call it a mimic, I think I haven't heard anything weird since yesterday. I'm assuming it's still over there somewhere, but I don't think it's nearby. If it's still anywhere around here, it's probably somewhere over near Tower 12, or at least that's what makes the most sense to me anyways. Which brings me to my shiny new lunatic idea: my Jeep. It can't be more than a mile down the northern track, still sitting there in front of that fallen pine. I could probably get to it in less than an hour, even with this wet and muddy ground. It had almost a full tank of gas, and I'm pretty sure I could outrun this mimic thing in it if I could get a straight shot down the service road. I definitely don't relish the idea, mind you. Every instinct is screaming at me to sit my butt right down where I am in this tower, and I know the ranger station will start getting a little antsy when Billy doesn't check in after a few days, but I'm also thinking they may extend it out a day or two in light of the foul weather. Maybe 5 days out in the wilderness, and then I'll have a ranger truck parked outside my tower. The question is, what they'll find when they get here. See, I've been thinking about it. Billy definitely knew more about this thing than I do. Certainly enough to not open the door when he heard it outside, pretending to be a Girl Scout selling cookies. That makes me think that maybe the fence and the trapdoor might not be enough to stop it if it really wants in. As pants shittingly terrified as the prospect of leaving the tower and making for the Jeep is, sitting here cornered in my window-lined shack, just waiting for it to show up in the middle of the night, is worse. At least I have a chance out there. I still have the Magnum. It's been holstered to my belt since yesterday. They don't issue pea shooters for bear protection out here. This thing is the most powerful handgun in mass production. It'll put down anything in North America as long as you can hit it right. Any normal animal, anyways. Who knows what this thing is capable of? Still, it does provide a level of comfort and gives me some confidence that my plan may work. It's on my side for now. I'm going to try to eat a granola bar to put something in my churning stomach and try to build a little energy. I don't think I've eaten anything since yesterday. After that, I'm grabbing my pack and heading out. Wish me luck. I left my tower shortly after 10 a.m., and let me tell you, those were some of the most difficult first steps I've ever taken in my life. Stepping out through the chain link fence into that open space beyond my small compound felt like I was stepping off the roof of a skyscraper. When I closed the gate behind me, I stood there motionless. Must have been 5 minutes, frozen in place with my hand clenching the grip of my revolver that's holstered at my belt. Even with all the stress and anxiety swirling around in my head, I was amazed at how keen my senses seemed in that moment. I felt like I could hear every rustle of leaves and smell every damp patch of moss in the thousands of acres of wilderness surrounding me. In that moment, I felt very small, very insignificant, trivial. When my chest began to ache, I realized that I'd been holding my breath in subconsciously, afraid to make even the smallest sound. I let out a slow breath and forced myself to breathe normally again, scanning the trees. I turned slowly in a circle, eyes searching for anything that seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. But there was nothing there. Everything seemed normal, at least to me. Casting one last look over my shoulder at the refuge of my tower, I started off along the seldom used service road to the north, careful of my footing on the muddy and uneven ground. I allowed myself to move at a slow jog, fast enough to make good progress, but not so fast that I was announcing my presence to the world. Not so fast that I couldn't hear the forest around me over my own breathing. I stopped a couple of times during my trek to catch my breath and take a drink of water, and thankfully still seemed alone and unpursued for now. I wondered if it was out there somewhere among the dense trees, hiding in the muted gray shadows of the forest. Or perhaps it had returned to my tower in my absence and found it empty, and was even now tracking my flight along this trail. If I paused long enough, would it suddenly appear, rounding the gentle curve behind me as it caught up to me in order to prefer to move more stealthily among the trees and underbrush, laying in wait alongside the path ahead, ready for my approach? I had to forcibly shake myself of that line of thought. It wasn't doing me any good now. I was committed to my plan. The thought of retracing my steps and returning to my lonely watchtower held just as much terror, because now it's out there, unmanned, unwatched, and abandoned. For all I know, the mimic could be there at this very moment, ransacking my shack. I definitely didn't want to walk in on that little scene. I can promise you that much. I ended up making surprisingly good time on that northern path. It was only about 30 minutes before I saw the dim shape of my Jeep waiting dutifully in the middle of the path ahead. The matte tan paint job and black cloth roof stood out remarkably well against the muted greens and browns of the surrounding forest. Urging my pace to quicken, I covered the last 100 yards before I even realized it and found myself standing at the door, hand on the handle. I paused. A chill ran down my spine, inciting an unbidden shiver, and I realized then how quiet the forest around me was. I wasn't sure how long it had been this way. I felt that something was out of place, and so did the native fauna. On any given day, the trees were alive with the sounds of wildlife. Squirrels and chipmunks chittered, insects buzzed, and 1,000 varieties of birds called and sang from the treetops. Not now, though. Now it was as if they had all left. It felt very alone in that moment, only not quite alone. Somewhere out there, in that sea of trees, something stalked, something that didn't belong in the light of day, something that didn't belong under the watchful eyes of Mother Nature. I was pretty sure she wouldn't have let something like the mimic evolve had it not been hidden in its underground realm. The door of the Jeep was thankfully quiet as I depressed the latch and swung it open. If this had been a horror movie, I'm sure an ear-splitting screech would have erupted from its hinges. But in real life, we tend to take care of these vehicles pretty well. In the best of times, they are the only convenient transportation for 20 miles or more. In times like this, though, it was likely the only thing that would save my sorry ass. I jumped in and pulled the door shut behind me with a dull thunk, subconsciously locking it. I almost laughed when I did that. The entire top of the Jeep was nothing more than canvas and plastic windows. A feisty hamster could probably have penetrated my little haven, and I doubt the mimic would even think twice about it. The Jeep fired up immediately when I turned the key in the ignition, and I threw it in reverse for the most ungraceful 14-point turn you've ever seen on the narrow and muddy service road. Once I got it turned around, I didn't waste any time directing it the way I'd come. The service road was really little more than an uneven and ill-maintained dirt trail, and was only ever used infrequently by the rangers and lookouts. As I'd previously mentioned, it was a rough ride, even for the heavy suspension of my trusty steed, so I had to keep it at a reasonable speed. The very last thing I needed was to snap an axle or bounce myself right off the road and into the trees. Considering the condition of the trail, with the fact that it constantly wound and curved as it progressed, it meant that even my best speed wasn't much faster than I could run on foot. That's okay. Once I got past my tower, the service road was generally better maintained and followed a more or less straight path. I'd be able to build some decent speed there and be out of the wilderness and standing at the ranger station in an hour or so. The abrupt appearance of my tower caused me to feather off the gas as I rounded the last curve from the northern track. I slowed to a crawl and squinted through the now dirty windshield. From here, everything looked exactly like I had left it. The gate still stood closed, and looking up, I could see the trapdoor also appeared shut. Maybe this thing hadn't returned. Hell, maybe this thing wasn't ever going to return. For all I knew, I was headed in the opposite direction. It's not like looking at a GPS on it or anything. It was at that moment that I nearly pissed myself when the radio, still clipped to my belt, squawked, and I heard probably the last thing I had ever expected to hear. "John, are you there?" The signal was pretty clear, but his voice sounded weak, strained. I almost didn't respond. I was frozen in indecision, clouding my mind. I didn't know what I could trust to be true, but I doubted that this mimic had read the radio manual and learned how to operate the handset. I snatched the handset from my shoulder and keyed the mic. "Billy? Holy? Is that you?" He answered me right away, and I thought I could hear relief in his tone, buried under his pained words. "John? Thank God. I was afraid you were gone." My eyes drifted to the trail leading past my tower toward the ranger station, toward safety. Another 5 minutes, and I would have been there. I got to my Jeep, and I was just about to haul ass for the ranger station when I replied, "What's your status?" There was a moment of silence, and I wondered briefly if he hadn't even heard me. But then he answered, "I'm not doing too hot, John. I'm in my tower, but that thing hurt me. I've lost a lot of blood, and I've been drifting in and out. I've patched myself up as best as I could. I stopped the bleeding for my leg." He frowned and closed his eyes for a moment, asking a question I was pretty sure I knew the answer to. "Are you able to get back to your Jeep?" I thought I heard a coughing bark of laughter before he answered. "I don't think so. Pretty banged up, man. What happened?" "Billy, son of a... It got into my tower, managed to get a shot off, but not before it got a jump on me. I took off before it did me in, so I think I hit it. I don't know where it is now, though. My tower is wide open, and it hasn't come back, so maybe it's dead." I doubted that. Things never work out that simply. Are you stable, Billy? Can you be moved? Another silence, and then he said, I know what you're thinking, John. Just turn your Jeep around and haul ass to the ranger station. That's an order. I dropped my forehead to the steering wheel, closing my eyes and cursing. It would have been easier if Billy hadn't radioed me. I know it's selfish. I know I'm an idiot for even thinking it, but I could have been blissfully out of range if he'd only waited for 10 more minutes. Still, I put the throttle down and got the hell out of there. I could still race for the ranger station, have them mobilize a chopper to come back for Billy. But they were at least an hour away. Factor in the spin-up time for the helicopter, and you're talking more like an hour and a half before anyone gets to him. It didn't sound good. Something told me it was unlikely he'd last that amount of time. I could still turn left. I'd likely live. But could I live with myself knowing that I left Billy to die alone in his tower? What if our situations had been reversed? Sure, I might be saying the same words he was saying now, but in my heart, I'd be pleading for that voice on the radio to help me. I couldn't imagine being in his position, lying there, hurt, bleeding out, knowing that his safe haven was wide open and that thing was out there somewhere. Look, I know what you're going to say. I know what you're probably saying already. Don't be a dumbass. This is exactly why everyone dies in a horror movie. I get it, believe me. I get it. But this wasn't a movie. My friend was lying there, dying in his shack. If I could get to him and get him into the Jeep, we could both get out of there, leaving this twisted nightmare behind us. Billy, I'm headed your way. Get ready, because we're going to wrestle you down the stairs and into my Jeep as quickly as we can, I said, cranking the wheel to the right and taking the western trail with more speed than I should have. John, I gave you an order. Get out of here now. Despite the situation, I managed to start a grin as my rig bucked and bounced over the uneven trail. Billy, I'd like to take this opportunity to officially tender my resignation from the Fire Watch. Now shut your mouth and conserve your strength. I'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Trying to be a pretty good guess, and before long, I skidded to a halt outside Tower 12, next to Billy's ride. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet air, my handgun coming from its holster and held before me like some sort of shield. I took a quick moment to let my eyes roam over the surrounding woodlands for any sign of movement, before quickly jogging around my Jeep and toward the compound's entrance. I passed through an open doorway, taking note of the heavy chain-link gate that was lying twisted 15 feet inside the fence. Another dozen paces, and I was at the base of the stairs, craning my neck to make sure nothing was awaiting me above. I kept the mic on my shoulder and said in a low voice, Billy, I'm outside your tower right now, heading up. For Christ's sake, don't shoot me. I turned the volume on the speaker down just in time for his response. Damn it, John. I told you to leave. Despite his words, the gratitude and relief were clear in his tone. I started up the stairs, revolver still held at the ready as my other hand ran lightly up the railing. My eyes were drawn to the red-black spots staining the gray paint of the steel steps. I found even more of the viscous liquid on the railing as I continued my ascent. Blood, but not Billy's. God, I hope that thing is lying in the woods, breathing its last breath. He definitely hit it, but I had no way of telling how seriously it was hurt. In a human, red blood indicated an arterial bleed, which was typically a fairly significant injury. With this thing, who knew what black-red meant? I climbed the rest of the stairs around the tower and stopped just below the open trapdoor. Billy? I called cautiously. A pause, then came his reply, shaky and with a wheezing sound I didn't like at all. How do I know it's you? Say something I couldn't have heard you say before. I have always admired and respected you, I answered without hesitation. He said under his breath, Come on up. I took another couple of steps, cautiously poking my head through the trapdoor. Billy was sitting upright, more or less, resting his back against the doorframe of his shack and aiming his own handgun generally in my direction. As soon as he saw my face, he dropped his hand to the side, the stainless steel barrel clanging against the metal walkway. As I stepped fully through the trapdoor, I noticed two things immediately. Firstly, there was a significant amount of that black-red goo splattered around. Secondly, I realized how badly injured Billy was. His face had gone gray with a sickly paleness, and his breaths came in ragged hitches. Blood-soaked bandages wrapped both forearms, and his face was covered in a crimson rag taped haphazardly down. His entire khaki park shirt was painted in a hellish tie-dye of shades of red, but it was his leg that worried me the most. A tourniquet had been tied around his thigh, and he was groaning, but the pants leg was a cherry red below that, glistening in the late morning light. "Jesus, Billy," I exclaimed, holstering my gun and rushing to his side. He waved me off, saying, "All beside me. I know it looks bad. Save it for later. Let's get out of here before that thing decides to come back for another round." I nodded and stood again, taking a quick glance past him into his shack. A twin of my own tower, normally Billy's looked like a war zone now. His table and desk had both been overturned and smashed, along with his base-set radio on the floor. On the floor nearby was a satellite phone, its antenna and display obviously smashed during the attack. Lifting his arm over my head, I helped him to his feet. He grimaced in pain, but threw his remaining strength in with mine, and we began the precarious descent through the trapdoor. "Did you at least get to make your phone call?" I asked him as we took the steps carefully and agonizingly slow. He shook his head. "Got here just as I was getting ready to. Excusing your voice, telling me that you were from the Park Service and you were here to help." He looked at me with a shaking astonishment. "Sounded just like you, John." I looked over the catwalk, railing down at it. He winced again as we stumbled on a step. "Almost there, John," he continued. "Well, yeah, I've never seen anything like it." I shook my head as we reached the bottom step and moved onto the rain-soaked ground. I grunted with exertion. "Save it, Billy. We've got a long ride ahead of us. Plenty of time for that later." He just nodded as I maneuvered him and ran to the passenger side of the Jeep and helped him climb in. Once he was in, I hurried back around to the driver's side door, got in, started the engine, and pulled the door closed behind me. Throwing it into reverse, I felt the wheels break loose as I stepped on the gas with a bit too much enthusiasm. I swung the 4x4 around and put it into drive, pointing it back toward my tower and beyond. Safety. I only had a heartbeat's warning from Billy before I saw it barreling from the underbrush at us. It threw itself, a great mass, crashing into the side of the Jeep, and Billy scrambled to get away from it, damn near climbing over the center console in the process and knocking my hands off the wheel. In a panic, the Jeep swung wildly left, and I stomped down on the brakes to avoid slamming into the trees. One of the front wheels dipped off the road, and the steel bumper crashed through a small cluster of oak saplings, halting us abruptly. The engine stalled, and everything went silent in that moment as we froze. My breath hitched in my lungs, and my eyes widened in shock as I laid eyes upon the abomination for the first time. My first impression was that it was much larger than I had thought, but the nightmare visage before me eclipsed such a pedestrian observation. The thing stood in the middle of the trail, still shaking its head as if trying to recover its senses after the collision with a 2-ton vehicle. It looked vaguely humanoid in a sense, but it walked on 4 limbs, clearly proportioned to such a task. It was hairless, and its mottled pink-gray skin stretched taut over muscles, bones, and odd, unidentifiable bulges. The limbs seemed to have joints that bent in all the wrong directions and ended in what had been claws, but instead of the distinctive keratin-composed sharp nails that seemed so familiar in the natural world, these seemed to be extensions of the creature's skeletal structure, protruding painfully through its veiny, translucent hide. The worst of all was the bulbous and disproportionately large head, topped with an oddly gaunt-appearing neck. It was oblong and reminded me of the shape of a feline skull. Its mouth seemed a jagged tear across its face, with ill-fitting and chaotically positioned teeth that didn't seem to allow the mouth to close properly. I couldn't see any eyes, but where they should have been, Instead, there were two bulbous and cyst-like organs, seemingly bulging and flattening in a slow rhythm as if bladders were filling with air or liquid. I reeled back in revulsion as it turned its sightless head in our direction, searchingly. Flaps of skin on either side of its malformed snout opened slowly, like some obscene blossom composed of milky gray bat wings, and I had the sense that it was using them to try to somehow locate us. It was then I saw where Billy's shot had struck the creature in the face. One of the snout flaps was nearly completely severed, hanging limply in contrast to its sibling. A gouge furrowed by the bullet's travel creased along the right side of the thing's head, piercing and ravaging the bulbous organ on that side and leaving it a deflated sac. When it turned its head further in our direction, I could see clearly where it had bled significantly from the shot, but I was horrified to see that the wound had already sealed itself, leaving a shiny silver scar to mark the incident. "I knew I hit you, you bastard," Billy whispered, half to himself. The mimic stopped its motion, and we watched as the uninjured bladder on its head expanded like a half-filled party balloon. It dipped its head a bit, and we saw two membranous slits in the top of its skull dilate. A moment later, the twisted sound of a human voice assaulted our ears. "I know you're out there." The voice was unmistakably Billy's, but it was distorted and wrong. I thought that the wound from his gunshot probably had something to do with that. The thing raised its head again, turning a bit more in our direction. It took a few experimental steps forward, then paused and lowered its head. This time, we heard what sounded like the painful roar of a beast, almost perfectly replicated, except for that same distortion we had heard previously. "Killed a bear." I held my breath as we watched it again raise its head and take a few more contemplative steps in our direction, slowly swinging its grotesque snout back and forth. I could see how the flaps of skin that were flared open, where its nose should have been twitched minutely back and forth, and I felt like it was using them to listen for us. "Knows we're here somewhere, but he can't see us," whispered Billy, leaning close. "But if it gets close enough, I'm thinking we're done for." I looked over at Billy and realized that there was no way he'd be able to make a run for it in his condition. From the look of the thing growing ever closer to where we cowered in our Jeep, I thought it was likely we didn't have much time before it got close enough to hear our breathing, our heartbeats, or whatever, even inside the 4x4. And when that happened, I knew what would come next. Billy closed his eyes for a moment and turned to me. There was something in his eyes then, sort of acceptance. So he didn't like it one bit. "Get ready with the cannon," he whispered. "Only gonna get one chance at this." "What are you talking about?" I asked. A moment later, I had my answer. Billy took a deep breath and mustered every bit of strength to fling the door open and stagger out of the Jeep. "I'm right here," he shouted, limping weakly across the road from the Jeep. The mimic whipped its head in his direction instantly, but tilted its head to the side, seemingly momentarily puzzled at this unexpected turn of events. Billy held his own magnum in his hand, but it was too weak to raise it towards the beast. Still, he pulled the trigger, and a resounding boom seemed to shake the air. The mimic flinched at the defining sound of the gunshot, the flap of membrane at its snout snapping shut protectively. But its stunned hesitation didn't last very long. In an instant, faster than I would have thought possible, it launched itself on powerful limbs at Billy, knocking him to the ground and tearing at him with teeth and claws. I heard my friend screaming, then a horrible soul-rending sound that I'll never forget as long as I live. But now was my chance, and I took it. I swung the door open and stepped out of the Jeep, my gun coming free of its holster in the same moment. The creature was preoccupied with what was left of Billy, but as soon as I brought the gun up and thumbed back the hammer, its head swung around at me. It crouched like a compressed spring, preparing to launch, but I was quicker. The report of the gunshot was incredible, and the recoil from the powerful round rocked my wrist back painfully. The beast staggered, and I saw a burst of blood and tissue explode from a wound where its shoulder met its neck. It howled an otherworldly cry, sounding like a bedlam mixture of man and beast. But though the wound seemed terrible, it tried once again to throw itself at me. I was set on my course, though, and took step after step toward the creature, pulling the trigger again and again until the gun ran dry. All I was left with was the clicking of the hammer and a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The acrid smell of gunpowder stung my nose, and by the time I finally stopped, I found myself within only a few feet of the horrific thing. 6 blackened holes stippled the neck and torso of the creature where the bullets had entered, and I knew that the destruction of their exits on the opposite side would be far worse. The mimic lay sprawled across the ruined body of Billy Johnson, its weight crushing whatever had been left of my friend. Black-red blood spread out from beneath the thing's bulk like an oil spill across a smooth floor. I noted with some muted surprise that the creature still twitched and slowly flexed its powerful muscles, and a wheezing sound was quietly emanating from the slits on the top of its skull. I holstered my empty handgun and scanned around the ground for what I knew was there. A moment later, I spotted it. Billy's own Magnum, lying half buried in the muck where it had been torn from its grip under the weight of the monster. I snatched it up and shook it clear of most of the mud and grass. Opening the cylinder, I saw that only one unfired round remained. That was enough, though. I approached the horror before me without apprehension or pause, my eyes focused on this thing that had caused so much pain and terror. I thumbed the hammer back and placed the muzzle against the mimic's head, which still convulsed with some small remaining life. I didn't know if it would be able to heal from the wounds I had already inflicted. Logic told me it was unlikely, but the silvery scar I'd seen from Billy's previous encounter caused me to question everything I thought was possible. I felt the tremors from the creature vibrate through the gun as the barrel rested against its skull, right between where its eyes should have been. I tensed my finger on the cold steel of the trigger, and the crack of the gunshot echoed throughout the forest. It was done. But even as I walked back numbly to the Jeep and restarted the engine, I wondered if that was true. I thought back to the journal I'd read, written more than 130 years before, and how it alluded to the tales of this creature going back long before then. As I drove the Jeep along the rough and winding service road, I wondered at the possibility that what we encountered was the only one of its kind. That the same beast had somehow terrorized cultures separated from each other by great time and distance, spawning the legends that the author of the journal and his companions pursued. It didn't seem likely. And now the door was open.